What if your only chance at true love was in another universe? A lonely English professor falls for a physics genius. His only chance to be with her might be in an alternate universe populated by flipper-footed birds and cats covered in rose petals. It's not only the low atmospheric oxygen that makes them lightheaded. When the happy couple is separated by chance, the physics genius must raise their brainy daughter with no other humans to ask for advice. Are scientific curiosity and the memory of love enough for mother and daughter to create their own world? In this unique novella, the author of Awash in Talent and Unpredictable Worlds brings you a fast science fantasy read about isolation and belonging the editors of hybrid fiction have called sweet, imaginative, and engaging. Welcome to the alternate universes of the Atwells Avenue Anomaly. I am author Jessica Knauss, and in this video I am personally going to read you my wildly imaginative science fantasy novella. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of the wonderful stories that are going to appear on this channel. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. The Atwells Avenue Anomaly by Jessica Knauss. Narrated by Jessica Knauss. AUDIOBOOK Publishing 2021. Copyright 2021 by Jessica Knauss. The ebook and paperback versions of this book have beautiful illustrations by Shirley Mackenzie, which you can see in the YouTube version of this recording. For Stefan and Joanne. 1. One autumn evening, like any other, I walked down Atwells Avenue back to my car after my usual early repast at the Blue Grotto. I noticed a two-family 1920 home suddenly occupying a vacant lot that the city had bulldozed not 2 weeks previously. Its white siding complemented a red brick basement level. It was utterly unremarkable but for the fact that it hadn't been there when I'd gone into the Blue Grotto. Interesting things never happened to me, so I suspected something wasn't right. I tried the doorknob, and to my delight, the door swung open. When I stepped inside, I found a perfectly normal staircase leading to the second level, and to my left, a sitting room or dining area with hardwood floor and period light fixtures. In that room, broken windows without dressings revealed a grand fireplace, next to which was an open door with stairs into the basement. Nothing was out of the ordinary except that the basement emanated an eerie green glow that made my hands look like broad leaves in sunlight. The only reason I didn't bolt back to my car on Atwells Ave was that outside the basement door, in stacks and piles and mounds, abutting the fireplace and well within the halo of eerie light, waited manuscript documents. I picked up the top sheet on a tall stack. It appeared to be the beginning of a novel or long confession in English, something about being a psychic. I was starting a sabbatical with no viable book ideas. No one wants to read another book about 19th century women writers written by a 21st century man. So I was ready to seize any new research possibilities. I moved the page toward the window where the green effect wasn't so intense. Imagine my surprise when I saw the page wasn't in English after all, but in some alphabet I didn't recognize. I returned to the stack. The top sheet was a continuation of the book whose first page had tricked me, and it appeared to be in English too. I lifted it and turned toward the window, but much more slowly. As the eerie light weakened, I noticed a change on the page. The handwriting, scrawling as it was, gave the impression of movement. By the time I was at the window, the entire page was no longer in English, but that strange alphabet. I moved back toward the green light, and the page was suddenly in English again. Surely this was happening to someone else, more interesting than me. I set the page back down where I'd found it. I peered past the stacks into the basement, and the green luminescence there was quite strong. I wondered whether it was affecting the fibers of my clothing or my skin or internal organs. I decided this was a matter for Janine from physics, or maybe Dan from philosophy, and exited the front door. I closed it as tightly as I could without a lock, But when I stepped away, I couldn't see the house, only the bulldozed lot. The perfect disguise to deflect random pedestrian interest. I told Janine about my little adventure when I saw her in the faculty dining room the next day. A green light changes written languages, you say? She blew on her tomato bisque. Fascinating. But whose house is it? How come we can walk right in? My answer, it's been bulldozed, so no one thinks it exists. Only confused the issue. She was keen to see the green light, whether or not it was inside a house, so we arranged to take a physics graduate student, with proper radiation protection, the following morning. They were standing in white quasi-astronaut suits in front of the house when I arrived. The graduate student put out her gloved hand for me to shake. Professor Shumley Brown, I'm Stephanie. Great to meet you. In those words, I heard a breathtaking cadence that made me wish she would say more. Ever since Bernice left me, I'd felt like no woman would do anything but scorn me. But I wished Stephanie would be the exception. Of course, it was nuts to think someone at least 10 years younger than me, with a scientific mind, would ever consider looking twice at a sad-sack English professor. Janine was less friendly. Robert, are you trying to waste physics time? I wouldn't have thought it of you. You mostly keep to yourself. I pointed. Look right there. Go in that door and turn left, and you'll see the green light. They shook their heads. They saw no door. So I walked around and stood behind them, and sure enough, I couldn't see the house anymore either. It's a matter of 5 paces, I said. Impatient, I made pushing motions to encourage them to stand where I had previously. Stephanie spotted the house. She gasped with surprise and positioned Janine. It looks as if it's not only the interior that's remarkable about this house, Janine said. She mused that one of her students should investigate how such an optical effect was accomplished. It could be a breakthrough in the study of invisibility. I rushed them inside to the dining room, where they were as delighted as I was. I felt oddly at home in this space that I knew appeared vacant to people on the street. It was secret and mysterious, but nonetheless as familiar to me as if I had built it with my own hands. Surrounded by peeling mid-century wallpaper, I demonstrated the language change using the papers by the door, and explained that I didn't want to risk taking them to another location, where they might change languages again, or get lost. Where is that light coming from? Asked Stephanie. The 2 scientists, more empirical than theoretical, crowded through the basement door to get closer to the light. I listened to their shoes on the stairs, then started my own experiment. I walked with my briefcase toward the window. I pulled out a sheet of my notes on Milton in scrawled English. I turned slowly, smoothly, like the cog that controls the hour hand in a timepiece, watching the loops and whorls to see what they would do as they approached the green light. The first movement occurred when I was at a 90-degree angle from the basement door, and the morphing took place faster, even though I didn't speed up my turning. When I was facing the basement door, in the full beam of green light, the words had transformed into that strange language in the alphabet I'd seen near the window in the other paper. It seemed that papers from the basement turned from English into something wildly foreign when they left the green light, and my papers turned from English into the strange alphabet when they approached the light. I turned back to the window quickly and witnessed the return of my perspicacious remarks before I inserted the page back into my briefcase and pulled out a printed book, which happened to be English translations of Atwells. I performed the same turning experiment, and much more neatly this time, the open page's words underwent their transformation. When I turned the pages, I found them to be transmogrified, with no sign of English or indeed the Latin alphabet, but with a similar look to the unearthly scribbles I'd already seen. I'd hoped for this very outcome. As an undergrad, I'd spent hours contemplating a facsimile of the famously impenetrable Voynich manuscript, and became so familiar with its curls and swoops that it felt as if I ought to understand what it said. These strange pages produced the same scholarly anxiety, but they had the advantage of becoming decipherable, with a few clockwork movements. I jumped for joy. I'm not using a cliché here. My feet briefly left the floor with the wonder of my discoveries. I threw my briefcase aside to sit on the gritty hardwood floor amongst the stack of papers, ignoring the searing tension in my neck. I thumbed through to see if there were any pages that weren't in English so I could turn them and compare the results. Really, I thought I would need a good camera to document original languages and transformation ones, a proposal for a student assistant, photographic equipment, reliable electricity in the house, space heaters, and at least one desk to work at came together in my mind. Stephanie appeared at the top of the basement steps. Her protective helmet was off, revealing a lovely auburn French braid. "Professor Shumley Brown, don't you want to see where the green light is coming from? We've done some experiments and measured for radiation, and Professor Asterion says it's okay not to use the protective suits. You'll be fine." I looked at her with what must have been a vacant expression, concentrating too hard on this extraordinary intellectual bounty, my own personal discovery. "I really think you'll want to see what's down here." Her smile shuffled my priorities to favor whatever she was occupied with. How wonderful it would be to have her smile upon me again. I rose from the floor with a groan and followed her creaking steps down the stairs. Other colors disappeared in the overpowering green that only intensified as we arrived in the open part of the basement, and a dizzying warping effect made everything appear to float in an ethereal breeze. My breath caught and my heart clamped down because only the top of Janine's head showed, above stacks and rows of papers, all written in who knew how many languages. Papers lining the walls from the stairs to the far end, and from the floor to the low ceiling, creating a rabbit warren of aisles just big enough for an average adult. When I finally tore my gaze from the tempting trove of research all around me, Stephanie was waving her arms and standing with Janine on the other side of what appeared to be a stack of Russian poetry. I wove through the maze, and when I rounded the final bend, I saw the Atwells Avenue Anomaly. Even after many months and an intense course of seasickness pills to counteract the visual warping, I couldn't decide whether this phenomenon could rightly be called an orb or an abyss. The physics crowd settled on anomaly, and I had to give them credit for finding a word that describes the phenomenon without committing to any indication of what it is. I could say without hesitation that it gave off green light, greener than any color I'd ever seen on Earth, and it was spherical with no irregularities, although its exact size hadn't been pinned down. The mathematicians gloried in its infinity for a surprisingly finite time. In only 1 month, they'd exhausted their avenues of exploration. The philosophers spent one afternoon in the basement with us and scuttled off to write papers that would quickly become a book and give rise to a conference, which was held at the Dunkin' Donuts Center last fall. I obtained an undergrad project assistant and shooed the rest of the English department away, figuring I'd photograph the papers and bring in people from Complet and other departments as I encountered languages I couldn't deal with. And so, after a desultory flurry of interdepartmental interest, the discovery became a bidisciplinary project with English and experimental physicists. My undergrad, Bonita, helped me move the papers into some semblance of order and make space for the desk and the overhead camera across from the Anomaly. I made up a cataloging system as I went along, photographing each page, reading a bit as I did. New novels, poems, manuals for machinery that didn't exist anywhere on Earth, each more bizarre than the last, and showing my assistant what to do. Whenever we finished with a tome in its original language, I had Bonita go upstairs to perform the transformation and take photos of the different alphabets with her phone to round out the visual catalog. She had finesse. I intended to put her name somewhere in whatever I ended up publishing. Unlike Janine, Stephanie took an interest in my literary work, stopping by the desk to see what new alphabet we were photographing that day. She, and not Bonita or even I, made the observation that when held at a certain angle, some of the otherwise average-looking books were palindromic. Sometimes a single folio mirrored the facing page exactly, but once she leafed through to find the entire tome was one long palindrome. Her powers of observation weren't the first thing I admired about her. One day, Bonita came back from the top of the stairs with the transformation photos from a manuscript I'd had high hopes for, because the paper was soft and curled, the ink smudged as if it had been handled by many careful, if over-enthusiastic, hands. "The words don't make any sense, Professor," Bonita said, back at the desk. "There's no pattern at all." "How can that be?" I dropped the triangle-shaped page I'd been trying to put back in order with a circle and a trapezoid, and joined her. "It's in English, see?" she said, showing me the digital photo, "but it's just random words." "Are you sure it's not a palindrome? How could it be totally random?" I studied the words, and after several minutes came to the same conclusion as Bonita. Stephanie graced the photography desk with her presence. After so many works of literature, I'd be surprised for something completely random to come up. Let me see. She took the phone from me, and her eyes darted all over the screen. She enlarged the photo and moved the page with her fingers to focus on different parts. Even I started to see a pattern watching her. Ah, see there? It's On Virtue by Phyllis Wheatley. It's just backwards. Day of realms, the in cherubs with enthroned, you owe. Lay nobler a, strain better a me teach. Still appellation higher a me give to. You call shall I what say, goodness or greatness, bliss and life, endless 2 steps my guide, but time of joys false, the 2 not me leave oh. See, it's perfectly clear. I was tingling all over. I had no words. What universe of wonder unfolded before me then, unlocked by Stephanie's poetic cadences? When does the physics major have time to learn the poems of Phyllis Wheatley? Mused Bonita. Stephanie, I'm sure the English scholars can figure out anything on those papers, said Janine from her side of the basement. I need you over here. I don't know how Janine could be so tone-deaf to the moment. Or maybe she was overestimating Bonita's and my scholarly prowess. I'd specialized in 19th century women authors. Phyllis Wheatley wrote in the 18th century, so I would never have figured out the poem without dumb luck or the help of some computer program. My admiration of Stephanie grew exponentially because I saw that she was what so many of us claimed to be at interviews or during tenure reviews, well-rounded. Stephanie of the auburn hair, who probably rejected as many offers of love and devotion as she received from the other physics grad students, and who was fully focused on her upcoming brilliant career in trans-universal physics, should never have even had a conversation with me because I didn't fit into her world at all. It was crazy enough that I couldn't stop thinking about her, even as I collected more and more career-changing texts. Our studies in the basement were so intense, we often needed a rich and tasty distraction, and that was when I would take them to lunch at the Blue Grotto. I was spending hours a day in a secret basement with 3 impressive women, and I was proud to bring them in with me. The staff knew me as the poor schlub who used to come in with his wife, but for the past 5 years had been dining all by himself. On one of these outings, Stephanie sat beside me in my usual booth. We're on the brink of unimaginable discoveries, she said. Thank you so much for sharing your basement with us. She set down her fork and held my hand for the shortest moment. I was thereafter unable to engage in intellectual discussion because I was trying to rein in feelings she couldn't possibly have meant to provoke. I barely got a glass of water to my lips with the nerves. I hadn't been alone with a woman since Bernice left me. Another time, when the host greeted us, Stephanie said, "It's just Professor Shumley Brown and his little harem." The host balked before showing us in, and Stephanie's look at me made me blush. She didn't wink, but it felt as if she had. We ordered standbys, such as caprese salad, arancini di risotto, and pistachio-encrusted scallops, because I was too distracted by Stephanie's comment to think of anything else. She sat across from me, and when the food came, I couldn't look away from her hand, cradling the fork, the tendons flowing harmoniously like piano keys. She noticed my attention and smiled back. I wanted to retreat into a coughing fit, but she started talking. I've been advocating for sending a sensor inside the Anomaly and hopefully return with the data. But the idea isn't going through? I couldn't believe anyone would deny Stephanie anything the way her lips formed around words. If she'd asked me to give up my professorship and become her personal assistant, I would have had to give it serious consideration based on her voice alone. Aside from that, the sensor was a good idea. "Oh, you know, university bureaucracy," said Janine. Her words, not mine. The day after that, I wanted to retrieve a magnifying glass from my office. Strolling through the campus without teaching or advising duties made my students seem more like individual human beings. Some of them were former students of mine, and they greeted me as if we weren't in silent, stodgy New England at all. When they had packed my classrooms in Sales Hall, practically bursting out the windows during the first week of classes, or even when they were the last hangers-on during the final week of any given semester, anonymity blanketed them. Now I could distinguish their faces, remember whether they preferred Milton or Marlowe. On the other hand, the buildings had even more mythical presence, with their centuries of history and my own minuscule memories. My work with the Anomaly was giving me a new perspective on everything. I went up to my third-floor office to become surrounded by publishers' desk copies, unreturned library books, and photos of Bernice, who left me before I was even tenured. I'll never know why it happened for the first time there, but in my mind, Stephanie was with me, and my hand was gliding down her braid as she clung to me, our bodies entwined in ways I hadn't thought I could imagine. What could Stephanie see in me? I figured she was in her late 20s, maybe, and my 40th birthday was a few months behind me at the time. Her auburn hair, eternally kissed by the sun, probably made my prematurely hoary head look like Roger Williams Park in January, covered in snow. I barely passed the math section of the GRE, and she could probably pass the English department's PhD exam. There was no way I would ever hold her in my arms the way I was imagining. I had nothing to offer her. I decided to forget all about it, and in so doing, I forgot the magnifying glass as well. While I was burying my nose in my extraordinary manuscripts to avoid openly goggling at Stephanie, Bonita sometimes laughed out loud for no apparent reason. Eventually, I looked toward the Anomaly to see the physicists systematically chucking a wide variety of objects into the focus of green light. "Is this what you were laughing about?" I asked Bonita. "It can get pretty hilarious, especially when the objects come flying back out, haven't you noticed?" She pressed the camera button, and it made the loud mechanical clunk that registered another photo. Stephanie's French braid flopped in front of her as she tipped an ash baseball bat toward the orb or abyss. It disappeared, apparently sucked inside the Anomaly, and Janine checked her watch and typed meditatively on her tablet. "What are they trying to accomplish with this?" I mused. "Why don't you ask them?" Bonita replied. "Because it would require standing closer to Stephanie than I could possibly bear." But staying in my head as I approached the scene, my line of questioning changed. I thought about whether the objects still existed once they were absorbed into the Anomaly, and if so, where exactly they were. "Have you ever sent a living thing into the orb?" I asked. I was thinking about a plant, nothing as sentient as a canary, although that's exactly what was called for. "We've been trying to get some animals from the biolab, but the ethicists have been holding us up," said Janine. The baseball bat interrupted us, careening out of the orb to shoot over Bonita's head and crash into the stack of manuscripts behind her. She adjusted the camera lens. "I'm sorry," I told her. "I had no idea the desk was in the line of fire." She waved to show me she was fine. Most of the comedy is in the randomness. While Janine was annotating her data, I noticed something I have to describe as a cat slinking towards Stephanie. "Did one of you bring your pet in today?" I asked. Stephanie knelt and cradled the cat in her arms. When she stood, I realized why no one answered my question. This was not a cat, even though it was the size of an average house cat, walked on 4 legs, and even had a proud, swishing tail. Stephanie walked toward me, and the Anomaly appeared to accompany her movements with waves of light. "Touch it," she said rapturously. "It feels like rose petals." The rose petal-like scales were arranged into a check pattern that appeared green and pink, no colors of any earthly cat. I reached for the creature's head, and it dodged my hand on a surprisingly long ruffed neck and hissed. It held my gaze, and I was looking back into sectional lenses like an insect's. I saw 100 reflections of myself in the eyes of this alien creature. "Should you be touching that?" I asked. "It could bite, or scratch, or rub off on you." Even so, I admired her bravery to show no trace of fear in the face of so much unknown. The creature coughed. It didn't sound like a cat coughing up a hairball. It was much more human, or at least simian. It was a dry wheeze, and there didn't appear to be anything blocking the throat, but the animal couldn't seem to get enough air. The rose petals on its hindquarters flared out against Stephanie's arm, and she dropped it. It landed like a cat, and before the petals lay back down, I could make out slits in the purple skin underneath. Were they gills? Before anyone could investigate further, the animal jumped toward the Anomaly and disappeared. No one said anything for a long moment. I cleared my throat. "Has anything come from the other side before?" "This was the first time we've seen anything like that," Janine typed furiously on her tablet. "We've witnessed something of monumental proportions," I said. "That animal has just proved that there is space beyond the Anomaly barrier." These papers we're cataloging, don't they come from beyond the barrier? Asked Bonita. Don't they prove the existence of a physical space beyond our own? Where else could these bizarre alphabets come from? An admirable observation, I told her. That animal was the first thing that breathed, or tried to breathe. Before this, we couldn't have said for sure that the papers didn't come from a vacuum, Stephanie whispered. She put the full force of her voice behind the declaration, I want to be the first to cross over. What? Said Janine. There's no way we have the insurance to send a graduate student into an alternate universe. Is that what you think it is? An alternate universe? I asked. Physics shorthand for these undefined spaces, said Janine, but Stephanie cut in. Yes, I personally do, given the experiential evidence we've collected over the past months. Her voice convinced me before I heard the words. I think I'm studying here at this time so I can be the first person to cross into the first known alternate universe. Do you have enough insurance to go yourself? I asked Janine. I don't think alternate universes are covered in the standard boilerplate, now that you mention it, she replied. I realized my breath was short. I corrected my posture and felt a pop in my neck. Okay, let's everybody take a step back. Janine and I will come up with safety protocols and make a proposal to the university president. We shouldn't jump right into something so unprecedented, right? Yes, Robert, you're right, said Janine. Please put my name in the proposal, said Stephanie. Anyone else interested? I asked. Stephanie stared at me so intensely her eyes seemed to change color from the flat green everyone was in that basement to a steely gray I'd only ever seen before in retired boxers. No one? It surprised me that there wasn't more intrepidity in that basement full of firsts. Bonita was young, and isn't youth supposed to think it's invincible? And here was an opportunity for Janine to resolve one of the imponderables of her field once and for all. But she didn't volunteer, and a hush fell over us as we finished up our work for the day. For my part, I didn't know what to say in the face of such awe, and in the others I sensed mixed reactions of fear and excitement. When I walked out with Janine, she grabbed my elbow and whispered, I have no need to cross over whatever that barrier is. I said. My car was in front of the house, so I chucked my briefcase in and we stood next to it. But will you help me draft a proposal for the university? To send whom across? I want to see what's over there, I said, and Stephanie seems pretty determined. Okay, I'll help you. We can work on it in my office on Friday. I could use a break from all these discoveries, said Janine. We'll need to include designs for a protective life support suit in the proposal since we don't know what's over there, and especially since that cat thing had trouble breathing. I imagined spacesuits from mid-20th century cinema and hoped Janine had better ideas. It won't be hard to justify your crossing, she continued. You're a tenured professor, and the house was your discovery. You could say you're looking for the source of the manuscripts you've been studying. Scholarly dibs, I said. Janine smirked. Right. But I honestly don't know if it will be possible to send a student, even a graduate student, especially one with as much talent as Stephanie. I can't risk her. What she said resonated with me, but here I was considering journeying into an alternate universe. I didn't want to be alone there, too. And the person I wanted with me was, perhaps unreasonably, Stephanie, the physics student, who was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, the most intelligent person I'd ever spoken to, and always treated me kindly. How many years is it until Stephanie graduates? By the time the university lets students across, she could be long gone. If she focuses on writing this summer, she could earn her degree next year. Then she could join the project as a postdoc or a full-fledged scientist. But I don't think she can write this summer, I mused. She has so much more experimentation to do with the anomaly, even if she doesn't go through. I sensed that Stephanie's desire to pass through the phenomenon was more visceral than mine. She seemed to be studying physics for its own sake, not necessarily because making a discovery or solving an age-old problem in one brilliant moment would guarantee her success for life. Her interest in the possible alternate universe probably sprang from the same pure source. She just wanted to see what was there. And I wanted her to see it. Right, so she can stay in Providence and experiment, and she'll be thrilled with the records and accounts you and other professional explorers bring back, Janine said. I could write poetry about whatever happens beyond the anomaly, I said, thinking of something our department head had commented about the death of poetry, and how much Stephanie appreciated those backwards lines from another universe. And I think we should start calling it the Shumley Brown Portal. Ever wanted to be famous among physicists? The idea plunged me into a fantasy in which all the physicists and science fiction writers of the world cited my name on a daily basis. At last, someone would write my biography, and it would become an instant bestseller. The English department would be unable to handle all the new students applying to attend classes given by the famous, intrepid Professor Shumley Brown. Even Bernice, probably living in a condo in Phoenix with her Latin lover, would hear tell of my feats and come crawling back. Would I even give her the time of day? I looked up to see Stephanie hurrying toward her car, her braids shining orange in the dying sunlight. She collapsed into her driver's seat, and the look she shot me from behind the windshield let me know she'd heard everything. I spent the night at my kitchen table with a legal pad, my neck tied up in knots, scribbling ideas that could justify putting Stephanie into the proposal. My recycle bin was full of yellow-lined papers by morning. I wanted Stephanie in the other universe more than she probably did, but Janine was right. Too many years in the system gave me intimate knowledge that it's in place to slow down discoveries, not to serve as a vehicle for making brilliant young minds' dreams come true. Maybe she was too brave for her own good, and my role should be doing what was best to protect her precious life. Whereas Stephanie was all potential, I'd already done my living, and in fact didn't have a lot to show for my personal life. The ladies in the basement were the closest thing I'd had to people caring about me in a long time. Most days I woke up excited to get back to the Anomaly, but the next morning, the way I imagined Stephanie would judge my actions, or lack thereof, took the spring out of my step. Bonita was at her place at the bottom of the stairs, and Janine was busy nearer the Anomaly. I made my priorities clear. "Where's Stephanie?" "I haven't seen her this morning," said Janine. "She's definitely supposed to be here." Bonita gasped. She stood up from the desk where she was photographing an especially lovely manuscript that appeared to be about botany, with each page in the shape of the leaves of the plant it was written about. "I was here early this morning. I saw her." "What happened?" I demanded. "It seemed like a normal morning. I got started on the second part of this manuscript, and Stephanie was bringing in a bunch of objects to throw into the orb as usual. I went to get my phone out of my car, and by the time I got back, Professor Asterion was here, but Stephanie wasn't." "Oh, dear God!" I cried. "Why didn't anyone notice that the most talented scientist in a century is missing? She's always here. She loves the Anomaly. Do you know what this means?" "You don't think," said Janine. It was clear that Stephanie and I had the strongest bond in the group. What would link a crotchety old English professor with a melodic-voiced, gorgeous young physicist? Our taste for adventure. Which is why I assumed that, without consent or protection, Stephanie had crossed through the Anomaly. There was only one thing to do. Maybe because they were pinching me, I untied my shoes and stepped out of them toward the Anomaly, onto the concrete floor, which looked mossy in the green light. "No, you wouldn't," said Janine. "Are we going to let our comrade fall?" I said. That was rather inspired. A bird with puce and purple chevron pattern along its wings, and oddly flipper-like feet, erupted out of the orb and landed atop the leafy manuscript in front of Bonita with extraordinary grace. It seemed like a cue. I tucked it under my arm. It was about the size of a Rhode Island red hen, took a deep breath, and sprinted toward the Anomaly. The following is the fragment from the poem On Virtue by Phyllis Wheatley that appears in the book, but forwards instead of backwards. "O leave me not to the false joys of time, but guide my steps to endless life and bliss. Greatness or goodness, say what I shall call thee, to give an higher appellation still. Teach me a better strain, a nobler lay, O thou enthroned with cherubs in the realms of day." 2. I half expected to feel a splash of liquid against my skin as I broke the, for lack of a better word, barrier, but no such tactile sensation confirmed that anything out of the ordinary had happened, except that my muscles relaxed and the knots in my neck untied. The flipper-footed bird flew out of my lax arms into a landscape such as I, nor anyone, aside from Stephanie, had ever seen before. An impression of brilliant whiteness was probably encouraged by the green hue of everything in the basement mere seconds previously. The sky had cerulean blue globules shining in it. I would call them clouds, except that they weren't. The vegetation on the ground was bright red and orange, and none of it very tall. It only averaged as high as my sock-clad toes. The plant's lowness and no apparent hills, mountains, or structures made me feel I was being drawn forward into the vast openness. I opened my mouth to call for Stephanie, but I could tell the atmosphere hadn't much oxygen in it. I was gasping without moving a muscle, much like the otherworldly cat had when it visited us so briefly. I turned around to get a look at the anomaly, which by this time I considered to be a portal, plain and simple, and which I intended to go back through to get a breath of fresh air, if nothing else. But I couldn't see anything behind me that was any different than what was in front. I felt pressure building up my temples. Stephanie must have been asphyxiated shortly after her arrival here, just as I was about to be. But if so, where was her body? With no options left, I took a few steps and was astonished when what I can only describe as houses came into view. It appeared to be the same effect as with the houses on Atwells Ave back in Providence. You had to be standing in the exact right spot in order to see them. They were covered with what looked like different species of broad leaves in the most improbable color combinations. Orange with purple spots, stripes in blue and green, ochre and gray paisley. I intuited that they were structures because of the scientifically straight lines they displayed, but otherwise there was no clue. They were inverted pyramids, and they rocked in a non-existent breeze, balancing on their points. Which one did I want to visit in my last few moments of life before I suffocated? One with green and black arcs on it attracted me, not because of its design, but because it had a chimney-like device sticking out of its roof. None of the others had such a thing, and it was also curious because rather than emitting smoke tendrils into the sky, it was pulling the blue globules down inside of it. I laid my hand on the lozenge-shaped door, which was warm and covered with grizzled fur. It lifted up and inward like a hatch. At the end of the foyer, I saw a young woman, normal in every way, except that she was wearing one of the non-clouds as a helmet. "Stephanie?" I gasped. "Professor Shumley Brown!" "Call me Robert." With the house's rebalancing effort, I pitched over onto the plush carpet, gasping for air. I must have passed out because I came to, stretched out comfortably on a semi-liquid couch that ebbed and flowed with the house's movement. Everything looked blue, but I was breathing easily. I put my hands to my face and felt the gelatinous cloud-like thing encasing my head. Stephanie was standing over me, steady on her sea legs. When they get big enough, they fall of their own accord. I was lucky that one broke over my head as soon as I crossed over, and in the time since I've developed this chimney harvesting system, so I never run out of oxygen. "Amazing! You've only been here a few hours." "Really? I thought it was a few days. I thought perhaps you'd left me for dead." "Is that why you didn't come back?" I asked hopefully. "Maybe partly, but I also can't find the portal anymore." "That's disappointing to hear." I sat up. "I'm here to rescue you, but when I looked back toward the anomaly, the portal, I couldn't see it anymore either." "You have to look into the exact right perspective to see most things here. That must go for the portal, too." "Can we travel with these cloud helmets? If you come with me back to the entry point, we'll have 2 pairs of eyes on it instead of 1. Statistically, that ups the odds, doesn't it?" I smiled my "I'm an English teacher, I don't know math" smile. "It's a fine idea." She held out her hands. I wasn't sure whether it was the strange atmosphere or her touch, but I made it off the couch effortlessly. Outside, looking through the transparent blue substance helped things look more like home, but I was struck by the quiet and deserted nature of the place. The upside-down pyramid houses slipped out of sight. "Where is everyone? Certainly someone built the houses and wrote the manuscripts." "I think the buildings are organic," she said. "I took up residence in an empty one, but yes, I've met some really interesting characters. They're just like the houses and everything else. You have to be standing in the right place to see them." I pondered that for a moment, then saw, in orange grass and shrubs near the area where I thought the anomaly must be, a boomerang. I pointed. "You see, I have a sense of humor," said Stephanie. "I threw that into the anomaly shortly before I crossed over because everything was coming back to us like a boomerang. It would be a good thing if we could send it back across to Atwells Ave. Maybe it would let them know that we're here." "Not to mention that we might follow it back through," I said. "Yes." She stretched the word through several syllables. "Let's sit down right here. Maybe we'll spot the portal, and I have a few things to show you." She took my hand again, and I followed her to the ground, as soft as moss, but nevertheless I gasped. Suddenly I was at the correct angle of perspective. and under a sky full of flipper-footed and other birds, the wide plain was populated with people of all shapes and sizes. Not much about them was similar to us. For one thing, their hands looked overloaded, with 10 thin fingers each, and 3 or 4 times the knuckles we earthlings have. They seemed to be chatting and enjoying a meal al fresco. Their language, which probably matched at least one of the manuscripts, came from every direction in murmuring bubbles and pops. "It's lunchtime," said Stephanie. She grasped one of the orange plants and pulled it up to reveal a large root. I call it that because of where she got it, but it was clean of soil and was smooth, almost silky. "Try it. This is the savory one." I bit into it without even taking it into my hands. I shut my eyes and let the juicy, crisp, pudding, scaly texture fill my senses. "Wow," I whispered. When I opened my eyes, in the distance I could see more buildings than ever, a veritable city with small places and high-rises, tipping and slanting each at their own pace and under the influence of their own atmospheric conditions. "Pretty great, isn't it?" asked Stephanie. "Maybe better than the quahogs at the Blue Grotto," I admitted. "The Blue Grotto," Stephanie murmured, "back in Providence with those other people." "Yeah, I took the team there a few times." Her dismissal of the team made me wonder. The time we'd spent discussing otherworldly linguistics? The inexorable hours during which I fell in love? Had she also felt like we were the only 2 people at the table? "Try the sweet kind," she said as a clumsy segue. Her hand hovered over several red plants. "These you have to be choosy with. Only the ones with the eyeballs are good for eating. The ones with teeth avoid at all costs." I looked closer, and some of the red plants had their own movement, not pushed by any breeze. Tiny yellow teeth in rigid jaws were feinting and lunging at the plants around them. They didn't do much damage except to the red plants with what Stephanie had called eyes. In the same place as the vicious maw in the other plants, these had black and white orbs, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes 5 or more in a neat row. Stephanie grasped one of these, broke off one of the eyes as if it were a berry, and held it on the tip of her finger. I couldn't resist. I slurped it right off. I got a lot of liquid and the taste of Stephanie. It was everything I'd dreamed. She smiled and offered me the comparably large root, which looked like a ball of pink caramel corn. When I took it in my mouth, it had the texture of raw steak, but such a harmoniously sweet flavor, I would never have wanted to spit it out. I giggled like a girl with no degree and no worries, and one of the otherworldly people, though I guess we were the otherworldly ones now, took notice. He, I used the gendered term for lack of a satisfying neutral one, had what looked like a fern growing out of the top of his head. It waved with his head movements. He cocked his elbow and let his forearm dangle almost like a pendulum. "Do it back," said Stephanie. "That's their greeting." I used my left arm to imitate him. He smiled. It seemed to be an exact replica of what I was doing with my mouth. "Extraordinary," I said. But I didn't know the half of it. A huge movement in one of the buildings caught my attention. A gray and rainbow diagonally striped high-rise tipped dramatically over, and what appeared to be a flock of birds swooped out one of the windows and tumbled toward us in a pattern that looked random to my non-scientific eyes. I had only figured out that the items were manuscripts, not birds, when they disappeared into an invisible point. "That's never happened before," said Stephanie. My scholarly intuition kicked in. We had witnessed the exact manner in which the otherworldly manuscripts had come through the portal into the basement at Atwells Ave. "Do you know what that building is?" "I've never gotten perspective on it until just now," she replied. "Let's check it out, please," I said. Any sense the flying books had given me of where the anomaly was located was already gone. We said farewell with our elbows to our new friend. We lost sight of the high-rise when we stopped at Stephanie's house to get some backup oxygen helmets, for which she had devised an ingenious system of tethering to their own mass, such that we could hold on to the tail and it would float in front of us. It put me in mind of walking a docile dog. We proceeded in the direction we thought the building would be, and I indulged in looking at Stephanie while we strolled. Her braid was as lovely as ever. The non-clouds felt like gel, but didn't leave traces on our hair or skin. As she breathed the oxygen, the helmet got thinner and clearer. I wanted to immerse my face in her helmet and live there with her. Given how anxious I was to investigate the high-rise, it was odd that we strolled. I felt no other need than to stare at her. She smiled back at me, and the building reappeared. We entered the colorful high-rise by pulling a lever that swung open two doors that looked made of sod. I gasped and groaned with delight. Stephanie grabbed my extra helmet and forced it over my head, but it only put me at risk for hyperventilation. Apparently, we weren't in the right perspective to see the walls of the building, because it seemed infinite. As far as the eye could see, arranged in single-layer circles, semi-liquid shelves cradled the greatest treasury of manuscripts the world, the universe, all the universes, has ever known. As the building tilted back and forth and side to side, the shelves accommodated the movement and kept the stacks in perfect order. The nearest shelves I could see displayed labels in a couple of the different calligraphies I was already familiar with. I was in ineffable scholarly ecstasy. What they could do with these in Providence, I breathed. Why there? Stephanie said. An otherworldly person appeared to drop out of the sky, for the ceiling was also infinite, in front of us. This person had a lush crest of red feathers from his crown down to the middle of his back. His eyes were similar to the non-cat from the basement. I couldn't count the myriad lenses, and yet they didn't give an insectoid impression. Again, I fall back on the masculine pronoun for lack of a better option, for there was no way to distinguish whether these people had gender. But they were people, of that there was no doubt. When he opened his mouth, the language sounded like a vigorous rainstorm. Stephanie and I kept shaking our heads with much regret to show him we didn't understand. Finally, he walked away a few steps and came back for us, the universal sign that we should follow. We passed Alexandria-fuls of who knew what hidden knowledge or fictional adventures, and I mused on whether I would even be able to tell the difference between fact and fiction any more. At some indefinite point, in the middle of the rocking shelves, the three of us, I can't think of another word for it, levitated. Slowly, with no provocation, even from the person I had already come to think of as the librarian, our feet left the floor, and we moved unequivocally upward. New levels of the library slid past us until we reached the stratum where the librarian apparently wished us to be. The floor was no longer visible, but no ceiling was in sight either. The idea that the manuscripts might go on forever overwhelmed my senses, and I gripped Stephanie's shoulder to keep from tumbling into one of the shelves and causing some uncorrectable mayhem. She beamed at me. It's a whole new world for both of us. We have to get all of these back to Providence, I said. Egg-sized blobs of yellow light left the vicinity of the librarian's eyes and danced around me. I couldn't help but interpret the gesture as his response to what I'd said, as if he'd understood. The blobs dissipated, and Stephanie offered her interpretation. Why can't you study these books right here? Housing and food are free. The people seem friendly. There's an endless supply of amazement. Are you sure you want to leave? It was a good question. The life I'd led up to then had been about scrambling for accolades since Bernice left. As well as a guarantee of scholarly fame, the house on Atwells Ave had been my most meaningful experience this decade. But looked at objectively, most of the meaning had come about because of Stephanie's involvement. I hadn't gotten much out of Janine's or even Bonita's contributions, as good as they were at what they did. On a practical level, in Providence, I was too old for Stephanie, even if it felt to me as if we were meant to be together. In this other world, without neck pain or stress or social pressures, the gap between us was quickly closing. Perhaps I had followed her here because we were the ones meant to discover a new world for its own sake. I haven't missed Providence, she continued. I used to love my life there, but this place has so much more to offer. Both of us. They were the most beautiful words I'd ever heard. I wanted to watch her lips forever. Before I knew what was happening, I was fulfilling my earlier fantasy of pressing our cloud-like helmets together, making them one, as part of the first kiss in another universe. She welcomed me and held me close, and I ran my hand along her braid. When, after an amount of time I couldn't measure, the spell of Stephanie's kiss was broken, one of the shelf labels caught my eye. It read, Biology, just like that, in English. Stephanie, look! I see it, she said. She made use of the next tipping movement of the building to slide gracefully to the shelf. By the time I stumbled over, she had several tomes in her arms. These are all in English. Some of it is highly academic, but it's English. I grabbed the top book and flipped through. Amid diagrams, graphs, and text in English, I found photos of extracted organs I couldn't guess the purpose of, some covered in rainbow polka dots. I dwelled on one page, trying to put a name to the organ's shape. When I looked up, the librarian was right next to me, flapping his arms, elbows out, and his face wore an expression I've since come to interpret as excitement or encouragement. Are these your internal organs? I asked. Of course not, he said. I'm intact. Well, I mean your species. Are these your people's internal organs? No, that's a book about swimming monkeys. If you're interested in people, come this way. He made a scooping motion with 8 of the fingers on his left hand. The other 2 appeared to be thumbs, opposable with the other fingers and with themselves. Fascinated, I set the book on the nearest shelf, only to provoke more yellow blobs from my interlocutor's eyes. That's not where that goes, he said. I thought that was such a librarian thing to say. It was then that I noticed I could understand his speech. Stephanie, where are you? You've got to come here right now. She had slipped away while I was gawking at photos. Here I am, she said. I checked these books, and they turn into alien languages when I take them over there. She handed them respectfully to the librarian, who shelved them efficiently, with so many fingers and joints. Thank you, and this book is from back there in the stacks, completely unintelligible over there. Now look. She held the loosely bound volume open to a double-page map of some unknown world. The names weren't exactly familiar, but at least they were in the Latin alphabet, and we could attempt to pronounce them. It's just like in the basement on Atwells Ave, I said, and that goes for speech too. I've been having a nice conversation with this gentleman here. Really? She turned to him. Hello? Hi, he said, with that pleasant expression. We found the key to this universe, Stephanie exclaimed. She jumped into my arms, and we danced around the space, dipping and turning with the building's rhythm, while the librarian ferried the geography book back to its place in the stacks. The librarian came back and waited patiently for us to stop rejoicing. He helped us bring a table that rested on a levitating sphere so it could follow the pitch of the library at any given moment. We asked him for books about every subject we could think of, and he happily brought those books and others he thought we might like but couldn't ask for because of our limited perspective. Suddenly I felt lightheaded, even more than the overwhelm warranted. I looked across the table at Stephanie, and her non-cloud was bare wisps around her nose. I didn't waste breath talking, but tapped her wrist so she would look at how thin my helmet was. She shot out from her hover chair to a window in a wall I hadn't noticed before. She reached out, but the blue gel structure hovered just a little too far. She looked wide-eyed back at us, and the librarian ambled calmly to the window and extended his arm to exactly the required length, grasped the non-cloud between his opposable thumbs, and reeled it inside. Stephanie inserted her head, then used her fingers, which suddenly looked short and clumsy, to comb about half the helmet away into its own clump and put that over my head. Thanks, I gasped to both of them. We breathe oxygen. What do you breathe? Stephanie asked the librarian. Nitrogen, of course. Of course, I parroted. Well, these helmets won't last forever, said Stephanie. My partner and I was already Stephanie's partner. We need to return to our oxygen harvesting machine and maybe have some dinner. She was right, but I wasn't sure I wanted to leave this mysterious section of the library. If we leave, will we be able to come back and talk with you? I asked the librarian. If you can't find this area, I'll help you. No worries. He winked a pink blob out of his eye, and I forgot what the word worry meant. As we left through the sod-covered door, Stephanie and I interlaced our fingers, so that our 2 hands together had as many fingers as just one of the librarian's hands. I followed Stephanie's lead, since she knew her way around better than I did. Isn't it wonderful? Stephanie squeezed my hand and flashed me a smile. A whole new universe to discover, and we found the key to solving so many of its mysteries. I'm so happy to be here with you, I said. I'm happy you're here with me. Shall we stay? I stopped cold. I gazed out at the white sky and red and orange plain, stretching like infinity before me. What did this place have to offer? Strange people, odd animals, bizarre food, having to breathe with a helmet, nothing from Providence or even recognizably from Earth. But I looked at Stephanie's hopeful face, and I knew nothing on earth was more important. In our original universe, I hardly dared to dream Stephanie would ever glance in my direction. I had been the only one brave enough to follow her into this new land. I'm not actually brave, but Stephanie brought it out in me. My answer came out hoarse, but I meant it with all my heart. Yes, let's stay. Stephanie threw her arms around my neck and kissed me. I will never forget how right it felt, how new and at the same time inevitable. Of course I should kiss Stephanie in the middle of a vast otherworldly plain, under the shelter of blue gaseous helmets. Why had I ever done anything else? When I looked up, I had the right vantage point to see hundreds of people standing all around us, nodding their heads, making their crests bob gracefully, speaking words we couldn't understand, and emitting globs of light from their eyes in every color but yellow. The virtual rainbow swept around us, glittering like a disco ball before dissipating toward the ground. The effect was much like a good summer rainstorm, with what the scientists call negative ionization. I felt unbridled joy. I think they're happy to have us, whispered Stephanie. She wiped tears from her face and gave everyone her best elbow greeting. After such a warm welcome, we settled into a routine, which in the new universe was endlessly stimulating. Stephanie and I made a home together, in the house with her non-cloud harvester. Typically, 1 day a week, we stayed in and tinkered with her ingenious contraption. 2 days a week, I would find my way to that spot in the library to converse with the librarian and other people curious to talk with the funny foreigner and study the manuscripts I could read. Stephanie and I called people Jivins, the closest approximation to their word for themselves that we could manage. On occasion, I missed not having access to my colleagues at Brown, their literary and linguistic talents, but not necessarily their persons. The other days I accompanied Stephanie on her expeditions, and those were the best of all. Not a single one of those days lacked a new discovery. Never before seen creatures and phenomena cropped up in endless supply, giving us little time to study one before another demanded our attention. One day, after an illuminating session at the library, I went home to find that Stephanie had left a note for me. I'm at the waterfall. There were no waterfalls in this other universe, but I knew what she meant. I grabbed an extra non-cloud and hiked straight out from our house, past a forest full of azure trees that appeared to vacuum nutrients off the floor and nitrogen out of the sky with their sinuous tendrils always undulating. There I narrowly avoided being swept away by a flock of flipperfoots. I elbow-waved my way through a city full of friendly Jivins whose organic houses were stable cylinders instead of rocking pyramids. Many times Stephanie and I had debated the advantages of moving to the cylinder city, but landed on being able to tolerate our house's pitching rhythm for the sake of being close to the library. Also, the cylinder city had a rose-petal cat infestation. Finally, I headed up an incline impossible to measure because you could only ever see the next few feet in front of you at any given moment, and came upon my otherworldly bride. With many self-made scientific tools spread out before her on a blanket, Stephanie crouched before the solid rock wall that displayed the curves and flourishes of a petrified waterfall. 3 non-clouds were tethered to a rock, and I wondered how many she must have brought with her. On her second trip to the site, Stephanie had noticed that the wall wasn't exactly the same as the first time she'd seen it, aside from the rock's distracting mother-of-pearl sheen that played tricks on the eye. Measurably distinct, as if a different moment in the waterfall's trajectory had been petrified, she reported. She had been visiting the place every day that week in order to discover its secrets. I knelt beside her, and when she gave me the gift of her brilliant smile, we kissed hello, merging our non-clouds for a delicious instant. "How was your day?" she asked. "Fine, but I know that look. What have you figured out?" "It's incredible. You know, all week I've been trying different things with these tools." She gestured at the calipers, wrenches, measuring sticks, and other items mysterious to me. "Today I was trying to decide whether to take another core sample, or do anything else really, thinking out loud, and our old friend Phyllis Wheatley came to mind. Let me show you." She stood and clearly, slowly recited. "Adieu, New England's smiling meads, adieu, the flowery plain. I leave thine opening charms, O spring, and tempt the roaring main. In vain from me the flowerets rise, and boast their gaudy pride, while here beneath the northern skies I mourn for health denied. Wait for it, but I didn't have to wait. As soon as I pulled my gaze from Stephanie, I witnessed the rocky surface roiling and contorting, such that I expected to hear the rumble of boiling water. The next moment, the rock did what I can only describe as sublimated into puffs of mother-of-pearl gas that hovered overhead, dazzling me, Stephanie, and the turtle-like insect creatures that had been hiding in the bushes. "Phyllis Wheatley did that?" I exclaimed. The gas clouds began moving downward, as if to reunite with the rock wall. Stephanie recited the poem again, and the rock wall continued to emit itself into the atmosphere. Then I said, "Have you tried any other poets?" She said she hadn't, so we sat in silence, witnessing the graceful way the gases reintegrated into new flowing shapes on the wall before us. Then I cleared my throat. "O Rose, who dares to name thee?" The rock barely hesitated. Like the copious tears of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, it collapsed in on itself with a great splash, becoming a mother-of-pearl lake that lapped at the border of Stephanie's blanket. A few turtle bugs scrambled to get out from under the sudden liquid. Different poetry sets off different reactions. Of course, Stephanie mused. The joy in her eyes when she discovered something. Witnessing it must be the reason I was born. "No longer roseate now, nor soft nor sweet, but pale and hard and dry as stubble wheat, kept 7 years in a drawer, thy titles shame thee." The rock remained liquid, swirling under the force of its own tidal system as long as I recited. Stephanie brushed a rock droplet off my cheek and flicked it back into the lake. I gazed at her in mute admiration. The lake stopped moving to settle into a solid disk with liquid-looking ripples we poked at but couldn't break off. It's not easy to write about that place, to put words to the wonder. We had no need to name it. We knew where we were. Words are barriers to the things they try to describe. A name would only alienate us from the full experience of the place. I think about a year passed, although it seemed like no time to us. My hair was acquiring its former raven tones, and I felt younger than ever. When Stephanie's menses stopped, my first thought was menopause, but she demonstrated additional symptoms that made us cautiously rejoice. She was probably going to give birth to the first human native to this other universe. Stephanie grew more radiant, as if the new life inside her were shining outward in health and an ever wider smile. One morning she gave me the customary 2 extra non-clouds for later breathing, and I kissed her goodbye with a rub on her tummy for good luck. My route to the library was so routine I barely noticed as buildings and animals emerged and disappeared from view. I hummed with happiness while I levitated up to the biology section in English. I wanted to learn some of the details of what we might need when Stephanie's time came. My limbs were loose. I felt ready to run a marathon. I considered taking on a new fitness regime in preparation for becoming a father, and was only dimly aware that I hadn't seen anyone inside the library. I wondered, for the first time in months or decades, what time it might be, and whether the librarian was going to show up. The infinity collapsed. A wall with a window in it appeared near me. "No," I said impotently. The building jarred all the way to the side opposite the window, so that the window became a ceiling to me. I stayed afloat on one of the semi-liquid shelves for only an instant, then tumbled as if falling up and out the window, accompanied by some 40 of the manuscripts from the shelf. As I whirled through space, my head sometimes hitting a manuscript and scattering its pages over the red and orange plain, I recognized the phenomenon from the day we'd found the library. My only worry was that Stephanie wouldn't know where I went. But she's so brilliant, she probably figured it out before I was even gone. I landed on the concrete floor of the basement on Atwells Ave, and it was moss-like in appearance only, in the reflected green light of the portal. My hair flopped into my eyes, and it was salt and pepper again. My neck contracted as if it had been saving up all the pain in the universe to dump into my muscles at once. I cried out, and a young lady, I soon learned, was the new undergrad English assistant, came to push the manuscripts off me, while 2 spacesuit-clad guards muscled me off the floor to deliver me to quarantine before I could jump back through. Only a month had passed on this side, but a lot had happened. The physics experiments had been suspended until further developments, such as Stephanie's or my return, and the Blue Grotto shuttered its doors, abruptly ending more than 3 decades of Providence history. Ever since, I've been trying to figure out how to get past security and jump through the portal. Or at the very least, I could write a letter and give it to one of the graduate assistants at the portal. If they can slip it through to the other universe, I have some hope of it reaching Stephanie, so she knows I'm thinking of her. Many years have probably passed for her, perhaps raising a daughter or son alone, and all I ask is to step back through the portal and return to her, but the authorities have blocked the basement off to anyone not directly under Janine Asterian's supervision. Janine, whom I personally invited to my discovery, and with whom I worked so closely, now enforces rules against my attainment of an easy, simple goal that hurts no one. Meanwhile, the department is scolding me about returning a little bit late from my sabbatical semester, with nothing to show for my absence. I may not have the reams of vellum-like pages on which I recorded my observations in the other universe, but I would argue that the discovery of the portal should count for something, and the setup of the photography table and Bonita's training must be taken into account. This is the basis for publishing literature unlike any our world has experienced before. I hope they'll contemplate that tremendous gift before judging the way I spent my sabbatical. More importantly, I have achieved the stated goal of the humanities as a group of disciplines working together. I've found meaning in life as a human being. I'm as surprised as anyone that it can be something as simple as living and learning unencumbered by society next to the woman I love. A department that can't understand that most human of needs shouldn't be allowed to call itself a part of the humanities, or to dictate to me, now that I've gone beyond their mental capacity. No one seems to understand that we're all living meaningless lives, because Stephanie isn't here. I won't rest until I find a way to be with her again, in this universe or in any other. 3. It's okay, Mom. Go back to sleep. That was when I knew it was time to get up and see what laws of physics were being violated. My daughter was much smarter than me, and had been, for what I perceived as about 6 years, ever since she was 5. But because the only human she knew was me, she lacked the skills of subtlety and deception I thought were common in Earth preteens. I sat up in the semi-liquid bed that Robert fashioned in our upper-level bedroom maybe 6 months before he disappeared. I hardly ever noticed the way our inverted pyramid house pitched back and forth and side to side anymore. Don't even think about it, I said. Our rooms were open to each other, and I could see my daughter digging around in her chest of gadgets. If she needed something while I was sleeping, it meant she'd been out and about unsupervised. She froze. But I found a new portal. Roberta, I said. I'd named her in honor of her father, a man she never knew. She frequently asked me to call her other names, more like those of her friends and just as unpronounceable. I insisted on her real name, especially when I was trying to keep her in line. You know you can't probe new portals without me. Think of what happened to your father. Come on, Mom. Wouldn't you rather I used my probes to obtain data about new universes instead of just staring at a new portal? I wouldn't cross over without testing. Remember that place that only had 2 dimensions? Roberta had been finding portals I couldn't see since a few years after I'd explained where we came from. Jiva seemed to be a veritable pincushion of pathways to alternate universes. At first we would throw things at the orbs like I'd done with the team on Atwells Ave, but the only way to know what the world on the other side was like was to make the crossing. It seems scandalously primitive to think about it now. Thank goodness my daughter developed her probe before we came upon the 2-dimensional universe. The data that came back from there horrified me with its lifelessness. A universe with only length and width and no passage of time. Roberta's probe had remained outside the threshold, refusing to break through the black, shining orb, and looked like it felt stressed out just taking the readings. If one of us had blindly crossed into that universe, we could have been flattened into nothingness, leaving the other one alone in all the universes. If my daughter had been a little less adventurous, less dedicated to science, less in love with finding things out, less like me, I wouldn't have felt terror in the pit of my stomach so often. Don't you ever sleep? I said, rubbing my eyes in frustration. Sure, here and there. I take little siestas when the Jivans do. I don't know how you can sleep when there's so much to see and do. It was never night on Jiva. On-the-ground observation indicated that there were several light sources, stars, bright moons, revolving around this planet, keeping the sky a bright white at all times. The Jivans probably had folklore or scientific theories, and I made a mental note to ask about it during my next session at the library. I still tried to get my 8 hours, but because my daughter was born in the new universe, she didn't seem to need as much rest as a normal human, imitating Javanese customs in that and many other aspects. It was frankly taxing to try and keep up. What could I do? I lumbered out of bed, adjusted my oxygen tube, and followed her out our grizzled, fur-covered door, making sure to give it a reassuring pat so it would close properly. Over the years, Roberta had helped me perfect lightweight packs into which we loaded compressed oxygen clouds and carried them with us. A tube that hooked over our ear like an earthling microphone doled out the oxygen as needed. We didn't have to view everything through a blue cloud, and they lasted longer that way. Do you think there's an oxygen supply in this new universe? I asked, offering her best excuse for exploration. Anything's possible. She looked sideways at me. I mean, yes, all indications point to lots of oxygen in this universe. The orb portal has a light blue tinge, not unlike the clouds here. She grinned up at me and surged ahead over the red and orange plain. She gave the elbow salute long before I ever saw the Jivins we passed by, and exchanged verbal greetings better than I'd been able to pronounce. Having been born here, developing her brain in this universe that ought to have been foreign to her, allowed her to integrate to a degree I often found myself envying. I never felt exactly lonely with her and her zest for learning accompanying me all the time, but it did strike me as odd that in order to talk with anyone else, I had to find a particular corner of the library that inexplicably made everything understandable. When she was 5, my daughter asked me to show her how to make the emotive blobs of color her friends emitted. We were having lunch on the plain with several of her Jivin friends, and I felt like one of the buildings in the distance, as if I were about to pitch over. I'd been mentioning her father to her ever since she was born, but in that moment I realized she must have been picturing a Jivin father. I didn't even think the Jivins had different sexes, but how could she imagine a human male in the context of her short life? It was the only time I noticed any limit to my daughter's imagination. New England avoidance of sensitive subjects surged up in me and reddened my face. I didn't want to point out how we were different right there in front of her friends, even if they couldn't understand me. No, that's not it. She stared at my embarrassment. How do you get the color outside of your face? I'm afraid you and I can't make emotion colors like your friends do, I said, frantically searching for words that wouldn't upend her world. Robert was a literature professor. He would have thought of something better. Why not? She flicked away the eyeberry she'd been rubbing between her fingers. Can we talk about this after lunch? I tried. I never planned or expected to have a child. From the start, just like my daughter, I focused razor-sharp on science and finding out everything I could about the way the world, and then the universe as I knew it, worked. I'd noticed Robert, during the Atwells Ave project, of course, his kindness, his underlying sadness, the way he looked at me, perhaps not even realizing he was falling head over heels for me. Men had acted that way around me before, but none had ever made such a gesture, showing such devotion as when Robert blindly crossed through the barrier into this universe, where we couldn't even breathe without engineering, to supposedly save me. He was attached to our home universe and his academic accomplishments on Earth, but I'd been in the new universe for several days and felt compelled to stay and learn more about it. When I showed him what there was to eat, freely available on the Jivin plain, his delight was so pure, my heart reached out to him. It took leaping into another universe for me to see that Robert Shumley Brown was the only man for me in any universe. From there, all it took was a kiss to convince him to stay and make a home with me while we both pursued our intellectual obsessions. Birth control methods would have been hard to come by in this universe, even if we'd been thinking about them. When I noticed the symptoms, I was overwhelmed with a bizarre desire to have Robert's baby. As strange as it sounded, I wanted to grow a human being inside of me, if that human being would turn out in some way similar to Robert. She rewarded me most of the time with being far greater than the sum of her parts, even half-formed as she was as a 5-year-old asking hard questions. Why can't you tell me here? She said, all logic and reason. English was so inadequate. If I loved and missed Robert, what word could I use for our daughter? Because this may be difficult for you. Her eyes widened so much, I almost saw the pinkish-yellow light clouds the Jivins emit when they're negatively surprised, leaning into trepidation. I'd never said anything like that to her before, because there weren't a lot of disagreeable things in this universe. The science and the social habits of the Jivins had never been cause for anything but enthusiasm. I stood and took her hand. She elbow-waved goodbye to her friends vigorously, in distraction. We hurried home and levitated up straight to her bedroom, where I knew she would feel the most comfortable. I didn't know what 5-year-olds had in their rooms on Earth, but my daughter had decorated with sketches of animals and plants and creative impractical inventions on sheets pulled from the blank books we'd found in the library or on leaves with different properties that made them good writing surfaces. Her prized possession was a rock collection in a woven basket by the side of the bed. She'd been gathering colorful, striped, and plaid stones according to her own criteria since she was 3. I thought at the time that she was obsessively rearranging them. Sometime after this incident, I was making her bed when I saw them move for the first time. They turned and migrated, each on their own schedule, and my tiny daughter would sketch each new arrangement and track the patterns over time. I was amazed and a little miffed at how persistent my Earth mentality was. By that time, why did I not hypothesize that the rocks moved themselves? I sat Roberta on her floating bed and took her hands. "What?" she said, pulling away. "You've noticed how your friends make emotion colors, and we can't." She nodded, not looking at me, suspicious. "Maybe you've noticed that your friends have 10 fingers on each hand, while we have 10 fingers total. That your friends have colorful crests, and we have hair that doesn't stand up on its own. That we speak English together." "Okay, I get it." She waved her arms as if she wanted me to stop. "Do you get it?" I could hardly go on. I was so fascinated with my daughter's acceptance of people unlike herself. It seemed as if she didn't even register the wildly obvious differences between us and the Givens. "I'm not sure you've put it all together, darling, and I haven't helped. I've talked about your father, that he's not here anymore, but I failed to take into account what you might imagine. Your father and I both came here from far away. Your father was like me, not Jiven. You were born here, but you're like your father and me. Not like the Jivens." Her voice was hollow, like a child from an Earth horror movie. When she looked up at me, a tear had already run down her cheek. "We're different. What are we?" "Well, we're human." "Where's far away? Where did you and my dad come from?" "I couldn't publish it in a scientific journal, but my anecdotal experience tells me we come from a different universe." The tears ran freely down her reddening face. "I don't belong here?" She broke my heart, and I couldn't reply. "I don't want to be different from my friends," she thrashed, tearing up the giant plaid leaves we used as her pillows and blankets. "We're all people, darling." I reached out to contain her fury and received bone-breaking blows. "How can we all be people? We're not even from the same universe!" Even her eyes were red at that point, and I was repulsed by the sight of her vibrating uvula as she screamed. The flushing went down her neck and tendons, and veins popped out. I truly thought she might explode. Where was Robert? I needed help with this. Our house abruptly tilted to the side with more force than her floating bed could handle, and we both skidded into the spongy blue wall. She ended up curled in my arms, exactly the way she would be if she wanted my protection, which I gave with some trepidation. After a short moment of enraged trembling in a ball, however, she straightened up as if smoothing out her emotions. She climbed up onto her bed and sat calmly with her hands in her lap. Her face wasn't even red anymore. I sat on her bed and took her onto my lap. Her lip trembled, but in a few more minutes we were talking about walking to the forest with specimen bags, as if nothing had ever happened. Roberta and I had none of the same cultural references or even physical conditions to draw on as we related to one another. Whenever I told her something about where I'd come from, I must have neglected to mention that nothing about it was the same as where we lived. The differences between her and the Jivens were evident and irrefutable, and she wasn't stupid, she just hadn't thought about it before. I didn't know what kind of father Robert would make, as he was taken from me before Roberta was born, but my love for him, which had never lessened, made me hopeful that he would know what to do in a case like this, and that he would help me build bridges with my otherworldly daughter. I kept close watch over Roberta, even though I couldn't talk her psychology over with Robert, or any human for that matter. She seemed to have fully accepted that we were not from the Jiven universe. The important thing was that we lived there and nowhere else. Best get on with the science. When she was 9, I came home from a day at the library to a house that was completely out of order. All the cabinets, trunks, and hideaways, all organic parts of the house, were open, and Roberta was on the floor in the middle of a great scattering of instruments in odd pieces. She seemed to be assembling them in different configurations, and her concentration was such that the random swaying of the house didn't faze her. "What have you done to the house?" I asked, impotently. She'd clean all this up, I'd make sure of it. But it was never clear how to punish her on Jiva when there were so few hard lessons. "Hi, Mom. Remember how you said, you and my dad came from a different universe? I think I found a portal." I spent most of the pregnancy wandering the immense plain, trying to get the right perspective on the portal home. As soon as Roberta could understand, I tried to tell her more about our native universe, and the portal I could no longer find, through which her father had disappeared so long ago. But because I relayed the information on the basis of her questions, I was concerned she thought of it as a place of lack. Did the people float through the levels of houses in my universe? Did the houses spring up of their own accord, and did they tilt back and forth randomly? Did my universe have a waterfall made of rock, or rose-petal cats, or flipper-footed birds with paisley designs? I could only answer no. It was getting harder and harder to remember exactly what my home universe was like. It wasn't that I had plans or the ability to get back there. But I felt a need to honor the place Robert and I came from, and a hunger to think of him there, what he might be doing, whether he was trying to get back to us. Where is this portal? I asked. Was it a glowing orb or more of an aperture? Kind of both, her brow creased. I threw a few tufts of the aggressive plants at it, and they disappeared. She held up her hand to show me the plant's bite marks. I wasn't sure what was going to be on the other side, so I came back here to see if I could put together a sensor that would tell us if the other side was suitable for exploration by humans. It looks like it's going to take a while, I said, as if I were a member of a funding committee. Yeah, she surveyed her mess. Do you want to go see? Any hope that it was the portal to my native universe was spoiled as soon as we were out the door because she tugged on my hand in the opposite direction. That first portal, catalogued as 9 for her age, .001, opened onto a universe in which the only light was the background noise from its Big Bang, so no actual photons at all. It was a challenge to measure any other physical properties. The unspectacular beginning did nothing to dampen my daughter's enthusiasm for finding new portals. Since then, we'd taken many walks like this one, to a new window onto an unknown universe. 11-year-old Roberta stopped at what looked to me like a random spot. So as you see, it's an orb-type portal that emits a bluish glow. I may have overestimated the oxygen content, but at least we have the probe. She opened the probe's hatch and set it levitating at her eye level. I came closer and closer and still couldn't see what she was talking about. Help me out, sweetie, I asked when I was at her side. You don't see it? She rolled her eyes, which must be a genetic marker of Earth preteens. I certainly didn't teach it to her. She took my hands, guiding me to different perspectives, and I remember doing exactly the same thing for Professor Asterion when I had no trouble seeing the mysterious house on Atwells Ave. What had happened to my perceptions? Did I pass them all on to Roberta, leaving myself with nothing? At last, when I was standing at the edge of the forest, I could see the portal at about 2 o'clock position 3 meters away. Its light blue glow stood out from the orange plants and white sky around it in a glaringly obvious way. I cautiously walked toward it, keeping it in my sight, so I could watch the preliminary sensor readings with Roberta. The probe popped out of the orb. She expertly caught it with one hand, but didn't bother to say, "Look, Ma." I guess kids outgrow that. How many dimensions does this universe have? 17. She etched the figures in the purple leaf notebook she carried with her everywhere. Universe 11.011. Dimensions 17. Atmospheric pressure 1012 mbars. Elemental makeup ARNHHENEKRCO2. Looks safe to go in and take a look. I don't know, sweetheart, I said, yawning. I'm so sleepy right now. I don't know how you keep going like you do. How can you feel sleepy when this new universe has 17 dimensions? Just a quick look, and then I can plan a proper study based on my first observations. Take a photo, it'll be quicker, I said without thinking. If either Robert or I had the sense to bring a camera, or even created one here, my daughter could have if she wanted, then I would have had a photo of Robert by the bed. I would probably still have blown it kisses. I wouldn't have had so much trouble remembering what he looked like. My daughter could have put the puzzle of her heritage together without a traumatic episode. But on Jiva, no cameras existed that I knew of. Their memories seemed to be more reliable than the typical human type, and they likely never had a need to store such information, even for sentimental use. A photo? Does that have something to do with light? I'll explain later. I saw there was nothing for it but to forge ahead in science. I chafed at feeling like any attempt to raise her would be holding her back. Who was the adult here? But I couldn't forget the way I'd left Robert to his library investigation while I was off doing who knew what. I couldn't risk losing our daughter through a portal too, especially not for the sake of sleeping. If she was going, I was going. I took a deep breath and stamped my feet to focus. Take my hand. Roberta adjusted her oxygen source and gripped my hand, keeping the sensor at eye level in her other. We walked toward the orb and continued through it as if it weren't there, and suddenly our feet couldn't find the ground. I felt as though I were looking through prisms, the way objects popped in and out of view, and sometimes I could see the same object from 2 or more angles. Below us, yellow mountains, cut through with sludgy green rivers, gave way to purple valleys. But I couldn't tell if the purple was plants or something else, because we were undeniably floating farther away from it. Thank goodness we'd implemented the hand-holding protocol. A gust of wind flicked hair into my eyes, and when it lifted again, I noticed that the clouds surrounding us were gray in a mottled organic pattern that resembled argyle. Or was that just the prism effect? "So, the portal seems to be in the middle of the sky here," I said to Roberta's ear. Her face was turned away, too intent on her probe's readings. "Yes, I'll have to start looking up when I explore on Jiva," she replied. "Are you keeping track of the portal? I'm thinking this is not a place I want to live." "Yes, it's right there. We can go back whenever you want." Not quite yet. My daughter's focus was contagious, and as long as we could get back later, I thought we might spend some time studying the place. "Can you tell why we're floating instead of falling?" "Gravity is weak here. I mean really weak." She punched a button on her probe with her thumb. "About 1/50th of the gravity on Jiva. I'm thinking the rivers are staying on the surface through magnetism instead. We're not magnetic enough, or we're not the right polarity to stick to the planet." "Then I recommend we add some kinetic energy so we don't float off beyond the atmosphere." We kicked and used the hands that weren't grasping the others to swim over the yellow, green, and purple landscape. I felt more elegant than the flipper-footed birds on Jiva. It was oddly freeing. If I could sell that feeling to humans, I would be rich. "Slow down. My oxygen is whipping away when we go fast," I said. "Look, what's that?" said Roberta. A dark cylinder cleaved the sky, from the purple valley all the way to the gray mottled clouds. "Let's get closer," I said. We kicked faster. Oh my God. We couldn't get there fast enough. "Is it really?" The column resolved into shells, with patterns similar to the ones in the clouds. Oval heads variously shaking, nodding, chewing, or sleeping, waving tails, and earnest legs standing firmly on the shell of their nearest neighbor. "Good God, it is!" "What is it? What is it?" shouted Roberta. She shook her probe as if to make it tell her something. "It's the infinite tower of turtles holding up the planet. I read about them in A Brief History of Time as a kid. Now I really wish I could take a photo, or a million." "Huh?" said Roberta, but my mind was racing. If the idea of some crazy lady who'd once expounded her theory to Bertrand Russell was verifiably true in this universe, did that mean every idea anyone's ever had also existed in some universe somewhere? I reached out and touched one of the shells. My brain couldn't get enough of the leathery, hard, tactile sensation. The reality of the turtle tower broke my mind open. If every idea existed somewhere, then parallel universes must exist too. I could possibly cross through a portal into an alternate Jiva in which Robert hadn't been swept away, in which we lived happily in our own little universe. The last thing I remembered was Roberta saying, "Mom, your oxygen level's really low." My valiant daughter dragged my fainted form through the sky of the turtle universe and pulled me through the portal back to Jiva. There she let go of my hand to transfer some of her oxygen cloud into my pack. I woke to a bright white world, feeling much heavier but comforted with the gravity. I smiled up at Roberta's look of concern. "Seen any interesting universes lately?" I said. "Well, yeah. Are you all right?" "I feel fine." Pride and relief welled up in my eyes to see in Roberta a daughter who would save my life. I couldn't have said for sure that she would. The only thing she always did was surprise me. She helped me up and we walked to the plane hand in hand. The plane seemed more in focus than usual. I could tell without a doubt that no one else was there. Maybe my time in the turtle universe with its 17 dimensions had given me better perspective on Jiva. Or maybe I just knew it wasn't Jivan lunchtime. "So, what's with the turtles?" Roberta asked. "Ah, there's something I must share with you. We have to go to the library." We stopped by our house and added some clouds from the oxygen extractor to our packs, then headed to the library along the well-known route between the multicolored inverted pyramid houses in our neighborhood. "I have to apologize for not thinking of showing you this book earlier. I can't be sure they'll have it, and it's too basic for you by now anyway. But in my home universe, this book started hundreds of people on the path of science, including me." I loved that the library was the tallest and most colorful building of any I had seen on Jiva. Its rainbow and gray stripes kept the same degree of diagonality no matter which angle the pyramid tipped to. Levering open the green fir double doors and walking inside was always an exercise in reverence. Circular shelves of books, one on top of the other, stretching into what looked like infinity. It was like walking into all the prestigious university libraries I'd ever visited, all at once. The sweep of knowledge, waiting to be opened, never failed to take my breath away. I looked at Roberta and wondered if she took all this for granted. What seemed extraordinary to her when she had almost 100 portals to different universes under her belt? We took each other's hand again and floated up to the little section where everything we brought into it would be transformed into English. Roberta had studied with her Jivan friends and could manage in other parts of the library, but I wanted to find the original of this particular book. Let's look around in the science section while we wait for the librarian. I crouched in front of the semi-liquid shelves. It could be right here, I said. She knelt at my side. What are we looking for? It would help if I mentioned that. The book was so foundational to me, and I wanted so much to share it with my daughter that I'd assume she knew what it was. A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I'm familiar with the title, said the librarian behind me. I stood and turned around quickly, knocking several books on their sides on the shelf. At least they didn't fall several stories down to the floor. Even with my speed, the librarian was already out of my sight range, in search of the treasure. He's down there, see? Said Roberta. I think that's a fiction section. We watched the librarian's red crest disappear and reappear among shelves on several levels below us, his agile fingers filing through the stacks more quickly than I could have read titles. He floated back up to us with several books in his arms. It's a funny little tome, the one you asked for. I brought our folklore books for you to look at, too, if you like this kind of thing. I slid A Brief History of Time gently into my hands from the top of the librarian's stack. It was a first edition, 1988, and that old British ink smell emanated from it freely. I'm sure we'll want to look at those books later, I said, but this will do nicely for now. I handed it to Roberta. Would you read us the first page of the first chapter? The librarian and I listened attentively to the story about the famous scientist who got schooled by a lady who believed the earth was held up on the back of an enormous turtle. When the scientist, pooh-poohing her, asked what held up the turtle, her logic was infallible. Another turtle, and another, into infinity. We've just seen that, said Roberta. No wonder you flipped out. You've seen a tower of turtles in one of your universes, said the librarian. Astonishing. Yes, it made me realize my daughter hasn't read this book yet, I told the librarian. Go ahead, sweetie. Read the next sentence. Most people would find the picture of our universe as an infinite tower of tortoises rather ridiculous, but why do we think we know better? Roberta looked up from the page with a wry smile that made my heart race. That's what it's all about, I told her. How to explain my version of the meaning of life. This book tells a story about the universe as Hawking knew it, questioning every assumption and backing up every theory with logic if not proof. We scientists look at all the details of all the theories and try to make sense of the story, and when it doesn't make sense, tell another story. Meanwhile, in Universe 11.011, one of our most chauvinistic assumptions has become the soberest truth. You're describing my whole life, said Roberta. A tear ran down her cheek. As sudden as my impulse to hold her to me, the librarian joined us, and we all laughed and let go. Verdigris squares of light squeezed out of his eyes and dissipated in the space between us. Are you taking that book? I think I'd like to read it. You make an excellent case for it. I'll bring it back as soon as I'm done, said Roberta. She'll probably have it finished by tomorrow, I said, even though tomorrow wasn't a precise concept for Jivins. We elbow-waved our thanks to the librarian and descended through the stacks to the ground level. I assumed we were headed home to get some deserved rest. Roberta could read, and I could snooze all I needed to. As we headed through the alleyways between the leaf-covered houses with their intricate patterns, Roberta was looking down at the photo of Stephen Hawking on the book cover. Not to be nosy, but what's that box? I looked at the photo. Well, Stephen Hawking suffered from an illness that gradually took away his ability to move. At the time when he published this book, he couldn't speak on his own. He had a machine that read out loud what he was able to sort of type. That's what the box is. An illness? Roberta asked. I blubbered something about faulty DNA, viruses, and bacteria, but nothing occurred to me to make her understand the experience of being sick. Roberta was 11 years old, and she'd never come across the concept of illness before. We really had it good on Jiva. I was overwhelmed with gratitude for this universe where my daughter didn't have to work for food or shelter and where she would never get sick. It was hard to know what to make of this good fortune, this situation everyone on earth would give all their money for, since I didn't believe in luck or fate. I don't think you can imagine what illness is like, but you have much better things to imagine. I embraced her, then let go, thinking she must be getting fed up with so many hugs in so short a time. Hey, did my dad publish a book with his picture on it? I'd be interested to see it, and read what he wrote, of course. Robert did publish a couple of books about Victorian women writers with university presses. How had I never thought of looking for them in the library before? I thought perhaps the trauma of Robert's being swept away had blocked some of my neural pathways. I was going to turn around and head back to the library right then to look for his books, but I stopped in my tracks. I widened my eyes to be sure of what I was seeing, a sight I never thought I'd see again. The glowing green orb that was the portal back to the basement on Atwells Ave. But I didn't feel the monumental weight of the discovery, because the only reason I could see it was that something equally rare and desired stood in front of it. A human man. Four. From its component features, his face resolved slowly before my eyes, which were used to the childish features of my daughter as the only representative of the human race. He had 2 brown eyes and lush black eyelashes behind green-framed glasses. His single nose had a bend in it that called to mind a ski jump, and the right nostril was bigger and rounder than the left. 2 horizontal lips that appeared to have a velvety texture even from where I stood smiled nervously amid scrubby white stubble. His hair framed his temples with salt and pepper curls and stood out from his bald spot in a manner reminiscent of old-school clowns. Something that looked like a scuba mouthpiece hung from his shoulder. He scooped it up and held it to his mouth, waving at us with his other hand. "Who are you?" I said, barricading Roberta at my side with my arm. "My name is Fernando." He sounded a lot like the way I remembered Antonio Banderas. "And you must be Stephanie and her lovely daughter. Robert Chambly Brown sent me." My heart skipped a beat. "Is Robert coming?" "No, he cannot. He would if he could, believe me. The scientists at the Portal let me through because I'm a theoretical physicist with publications on the multiverse theory. They told me not to move from this spot so I don't lose sight of the Portal. You have to come back with me. Quickly, now." I looked at Roberta, whose brows were furrowed. "Are you ready to go home?" "That portal? No thanks, I've already been." "What? You've been to Earth? You've seen Providence?" "That's universe 9.000. It's smelly and dark and full of books from our library." "Yes, you know we lost your father to one of those portal's periodic sweeps. He was studying the books pulled over from Jiva into that basement when I decided to come here. Why didn't you tell me about this?" "That universe only has 4 dimensions. I didn't know it was your home universe. It was boring, so I walked back out and forgot it. Universe 9.001 was the first one I investigated with you, and Universe 9.002, luckily, was much more interesting. If you remember, it has 5 dimensions just like Jiva, and a slithering creature that feeds on methane." Those 4 dimensions, where Robert lived on without us, such a yawn for my daughter, had been accessible for at least 2 years. It was all too much. I sat down, hard. One of the red plants bit my pinky, drawing blood, and I hardly felt it. "Oh, please, hurry. Come through with me now," said Fernando, beckoning us toward the portal even as he maneuvered the oxygen tank on his back to check the level. "Your department and Robert are waiting for you." I'd been waiting for this moment longer than Roberta had been alive. I felt the urgency like a rope pulling me toward the portal before something else unexpected happened. On shaky knees I stood and took Roberta's hand. "Let's go, sweetie." "Seriously, I'm not interested." She yanked her hand away. "Roberta, it's where we belong. Don't you want to meet your dad?" "I need to pack some things first." Her voice was thin. "There wasn't much light or heat in that universe." "Well, you only saw a tiny part of it. Providence has everything we need, you'll see. But now that you mention it, I'd like to gather our notes for the physics department." "How long will you be?" asked Fernando. "I don't know how long this oxygen will last." He was hyperventilating, I'll give him that. "Should I go back and tell them I found you?" I felt the world slipping away from me. "No, don't go." "It's okay," said Roberta. "We have oxygen clouds, and you don't have to stand there all the time. I can find this portal again whenever I want." This kind of thing was among the main reasons I'd never been interested in having children. You think you're the adult, and they're the kid, and they know nothing, and you have to teach them everything, and then they go and show you that you have it all wrong. Children are their own people, full of secrets their parents may never know. I wanted to really let her have it. How could she keep such important information from me? She was sitting on our way home for 2 years, and it took intervention from some stranger from our universe for her to tell me. Just wait until her father found out what she'd done. And because at long last it was almost possible to make good on that threat, I swallowed my frustration. When we were with Robert, everything would be all right. "Okay then, come on, Fernando, we'll get you some more oxygen." We all walked tentatively, but in an orderly fashion, toward our inverted pyramid house. "And you can see our house and maybe try some of the local food." "Those pyramid things just disappeared," said our guest with alarm. "They'll reappear soon enough. There's no reason to worry. Really, you need to relax. It's going to take a while to say goodbye to all of Roberta's friends." Roberta halted. "Wait. Goodbye? How long are we staying over there?" I knew I'd misspoken, but Fernando was too fast for me to backpedal. "I spent 4 months waiting on my application to cross the portal, and it was only approved because I said I would search for you. Once we're all safe in Providence, the portal team won't let anyone cross again, maybe for years. They don't get in a hurry." By the time I reached for Roberta, she was gone. Lost among the pyramid houses we couldn't even see. "Crap! Did you see where she went?" I asked Fernando without much hope. "How could I? She disappeared like the pyramids." "She can see them whenever she wants," I explained, picking up my pace, "and it looks like that goes for the home portal, too. It's because she was born here." I pushed open our furry door seconds after it came into view and held it open for him. The house lurched to the side, only to right itself again. Although I stayed upright because I was used to our house's peculiarities, Fernando did a near somersault and ended up splayed at my feet. I helped him up, and his hand was smooth and warm and had 4 fingers and 1 thumb. I cleared my throat. "It would be best if you sat on the couch. It's semi-liquid and adapts to the house's center of gravity shifts." He nodded and sat obediently. "First things first," I said. "Why didn't they give you a full tank of O2? "They did. I waited for you breathing at the portal for a few hours, I think." "Wow, that's some patience," I said, examining the hookup on his tank to see how I could transfer some of our condensed clouds into his reserves. Our nozzle was made of the purple velvety branches of the forest before the rock waterfall. Their texture gave them the ability to interlock as we twisted them into a nozzle shape, perfect for minimizing oxygen loss. The hole in his earthly tank was a bit smaller than the nozzle's opening, so there would be some leakage, but it was better than trying to make a new container for him before he fainted. I have to teach introductory physics to hundreds of first years in Albuquerque. I have the patience of a gecko that absorbs the energy of the sun in winter. The image was strange, and stranger in his smooth, rolling accent, evoking a sensuality I hadn't called to mind for some time. Suddenly I was glad Roberta wasn't in the house. Looking down at the semi-liquid couch where I'd saved Robert's life all those years before, I noticed Fernando was wearing an olive green vest with a million pockets that framed his pot-belly as if it were his best feature. He was no movie star, but he was the only man, not a being of indeterminate gender with insectoid eyes, that I'd seen in what seemed like 11 years. Something basic took over my nervous system. I held the nozzle to the aperture behind his left arm. Little tendrils of blue gas curled out, but most of the oxygen was going into the tank. I rested my other hand on his thigh and felt his warmth through the denim. "Oh, that's better already," he said, whiffing from his mouthpiece. Then he stared at where my hand was. "Should we look for your daughter?" "We could go looking for her, but her oxygen will run out eventually. She could try to catch clouds out of the sky, but the quickest thing would be for her to come back here to the extractor, so we could just wait for her." A switch had been flipped. I seemed to be speaking from some place beyond my conscious mind. Using an adjustment of the nozzle as an excuse, I leaned in closer to him. White stubble protruded around a mole in the center of his cheek that seemed like the most attractive feature in the world to me. The house shifted more dramatically than the first time, and all of a sudden his full weight was on top of me, the stubble scratching my cheek. I crooked the nozzle behind his back so no more compressed oxygen would escape, and unabashedly hugged him to me. Human beings were made for this, The thought came to me so overwhelmingly, I wasn't sure if one of us had said it aloud. He turned his head so our lips were millimeters apart. Sorry. His breath tickled my mouth and nostrils. I imagined taking him to the waterfall, that most romantic place on Jiva, reciting Elizabeth Barrett Browning and rolling droplets of liquid rock over his skin. But he pulled away, painfully supporting himself on my hip. As he adjusted his mouthpiece and twisted to check the tank opening, I realized I was trying to seduce someone without any idea of who he was. You're from New Mexico? I came to the United States from Spain, and I work at UNM. And you're a physicist? Associate professor. I teach basic courses so the classroom doesn't distract me from research and publications. He took the nozzle from me and clumsily put it at the hookup. When no blue clouds were visibly flowing, he looked at me over his glasses with something that felt like disapproval. Who are you? I demanded. Why would Robert ask someone from New Mexico to Providence to help him with the portal? The discovery of the portal and Robert's adventures were on the national news. I'm more of a theoretical physicist, but of course I was intrigued. And later Bernice wanted to see what the fuss was about, and probably asked for more alimony. If Robert was making as much money as fame, he's not. Wait, Bernice? Robert's ex-wife. She's my wife now. A chill ran from my head to my toes and back up to do somersaults in my stomach. I swallowed hard. The taboos multiplied exponentially. Not Robert, a married man, married to Robert's ex-wife. I disgusted myself and felt repulsed by Fernando. Any urges I'd felt seconds before could never be acted on enjoyably. Robert was still waiting for me across the portal. The only man for me in all the universes. I glanced at Fernando's gauge. Your tank's full. Let's go look for Roberta. I stood and thought about my bedroom. When I started floating up to it, Fernando made noises, but I ignored them. The notes I wanted to take back to Earth were neatly stacked in a kind of trunk opposite my bed. There were more than 20 sewn-leaf notebooks, but I had covered the trunk with a large multicolored paisley leaf that had a leathery texture. I figured it was quite strong, so I set the notebooks on the leaf and wrapped it up into a sort of satchel. Roberta had lots of notebooks in various places in her room, and probably some I didn't know about, but it seemed like too much. We would have to make 2 trips at least to get everything to the portal, but before we crossed over, we could toss the notebooks ahead of us. When I floated back to the couch, Fernando didn't seem to believe what he was seeing. Did you not say we could wait here? I set the sack next to him and topped off my oxygen tank. Roberta would likely be running low when we found her. What's the matter? Are you afraid of a few small differences from what you're used to? I remind you, I'm a theoretical physicist. I let my colleagues design experiments and experience phenomena. I grabbed his hand and pulled. He stumbled up and out of the couch. I allowed myself to appreciate his hand as an art object. I didn't imagine that hand lazily tracing curlicues along my spine while we gently swayed in the canopy of the soft azure forest. That scene absolutely never crossed my mind. Come on, you want to get back to Earth, don't you? Fernando was a gentleman and carried the sack of notebooks as we headed out. He nearly dropped it when an orange zigzag, flipper-footed bird suddenly appeared waddling across our path. They could give some warning. You would think so, I said, but no. Why does he have flippers? Does he live in the water? No, there is no water. We get all our hydration from eye berries. I think the birds use their flippers to steer in the atmosphere, but that's really a better question for an evolutionary biologist. I crouched to pull up the root of an orange plant. I showed it to Fernando in offering, but he shook his head. I have some questions for you, I said between savory bites. Help me understand why you took so long to get here if Bernice wanted to go to Providence when the portal was on the news. The national news story was about the disappearance of a young Brown University scientist and the discoverer of the portal. About a month later, Robert returned, and that was when Bernice decided to contact him. 1 month, huh? Our year-long idyll on Jiva hadn't even lasted a semester on Earth. Well, as you've seen, I've been here with Roberta for more than 11 years. How long has Robert been back on Earth? About a year, Fernando said. We took time getting to Providence, then planning how to get across the portal, then waiting for approval. Time appeared to pass differently in each universe. I didn't have enough facts to figure out whether the relationship between time on Earth and Jiva was consistent, but Jiva seemed to go faster, between 11 and 12 times as fast as Earth. I had to put that inquiry aside because another cluster of pyramid houses came into view. This time Fernando did drop the notebook satchel. La madre que le parió! What is that? I felt deeply offended that someone familiar to me could provoke the revulsion spewing from his mouth and trembling hands. The Jivan was as good-looking as any, with 10 fingers on each hand, a face with light grey striations, large eyes with many lenses, and a cloud-blue crest that bobbed back and forth in agitation. That's a person of Jiva. In fact, it's one of Roberta's friends, and the yellow light he's emitting from his eyes tells us he's upset about something. I elbow-waved. The friend, whose name started with a hard plosive, but I could never remember the rest, moved forward and back the way Jivans did when they wanted us to follow them. Let's see if Roberta's at his house. I picked up the satchel, and it was just as well I didn't leave it to Fernando, because when the friend opened the scaly red polka-dotted hatch door of his home, Fernando passed out. He didn't appear to have hurt himself, so I stepped over him and into the chartreuse and teal paisley house. It seemed like everyone on Jiva was crowded into the living room space, crests in every imaginable color, waggling, thin-fingered hands gesticulating, their waterfall language full of clicks and buzzing, and a veritable miasma of yellow light describing their agitation. In case all the other clues were lost on me, I could see how the situation might overload someone who hadn't lived on Jiva for more than a decade. I glanced back at Fernando. He seemed all right with his mouthpiece close to his nostrils, so I turned to my daughter. She stood in the center of the commotion, red-faced and looking at me defiantly, taking shallow breaths. My instinct was to tell everyone to back away and give her some room to breathe, but of course that didn't matter on Jiva. I knelt next to her and transferred some of my oxygen supply to her tank. The house did a rolling tilt. Everyone rode out with aplomb. I brushed her hair from her brow. What's going on? Nobody wants me to go. Of course they don't. I looked around at their serious faces. I wouldn't either if I were you, I told them, but Roberta belongs in the other universe with her father and me. Translate for me, sweetie. No, they know what you think already, and they kind of agree, but we've come up with a plan. We can have the best of both universes. She beamed at her friends, and they emitted lavender light from their eyes. It cleared away the yellow and made me feel relaxed all of a sudden. A Jivan with a red and white striped crest, whom I knew as Jessica, spoke what seemed like a poem, and Roberta replied in kind. How in the universes could we have it both ways? I said. It's so simple and lucky, Kerpidgeons suggested, that this didn't have to be an either-or situation. Tarkan asked me why this had suddenly come about. When I told them about Fernando, Rapskink put it all together. Where is Fernando? He hasn't crossed back, has he? I opened the hatch door, and when Jerica saw Fernando lying there, woozily lifting his head, he gently brought him inside to their resting ledge. They didn't have a semi-liquid place to rest, so I worried a little that Fernando would slide off in a center of gravity shift. For the time being, he was fine. One of the other friends offered him some eyeberries, but he shut his eyes tight at the idea. You were saying? I said, taking a fortifying whiff of oxygen. Okay, we have Fernando here, and they have my dad over there. What we do is, instead of crossing the portal, we send across a note that says we're not giving them back Fernando until they let my dad back here. It struck me as an elegant solution. Robert back in my arms without having to leave Jiva. Or even if they never let Robert through, we could keep Fernando. Bernice wasn't in this universe, and he could adapt eventually, but... What you're talking about is a ransom note. Do you want to become a kidnapper? Frankly, I'm surprised. I've never known the Jivans to be so devious. I've never heard those words before, Roberta said, pouting to show her innocence. That universe must be a bad influence. I had to agree. No signs of subterfuge or trickery in 11 years. And suddenly now, there they were, in full bloom after only the smallest exposure to Earth, my home universe. Maybe I could send these notebooks to them with the note, as a show of goodwill, that we don't really mean any harm, I found myself saying. Roberta widened her eyes. You mean you'll do it? She squeaked something to the Jivans. I imagined she told them I was going along with it, and they burbled and emitted pastel colors in reply. I opened the satchel and looked for a blank page in one of the notebooks. Let's let Fernando rest here and compose our message next to the portal. I feel crowded here. Roberta had a raucous conversation with her friends, probably telling them to go home. Everything was fine. I tore out the tawny blank page, and my daughter and I, and most of the Jivans, left Kerpidgeons' house and elbow-waved their see-you-laters. I had to give one last try to making her see reason. But, sweetie, are you sure you don't want to even try our home universe for a little while? I said when we were by ourselves. near our favorite lunch spot on the plane. "I've been thinking about your future. I don't know if you've considered this, but you'll want a partner soon, a man or a woman, and in the end, the Jivens are neither." The look of dismay on her face told me I was still thinking too much in binary for Roberta, who had grown up in utter absence of gender roles. As I was trying to think of words suited to her wide-open mind on this topic, she blushed and sat down. "I think I like Tarkan. Is there someone on Earth better than Tarkan?" "Well, better, no," I said, joining her on the ground. "Just a little more like you, maybe." I suppose she could be queer with a Jiven if that was what she really wanted. But what do you think about having your own children? No Jiven can help you with that. "Gross, Mom!" She was only 11. How could she possibly know what she might want in 10 years? Or even 5? I had everything for a short time, and all too quickly I lost Robert, the keystone of my happiness. I knew, as my daughter didn't, that Jiva was, in fact, the loneliest place in all the universes. She pulled at the red plants, deftly avoiding bites. "Hey, are you trying to distract me? We should be writing the note." "You're right, of course." I took out the stylus I'd made from the rock waterfall and poised it over the leaf. "What do you think it should say?" "Let's see. How about, 'Send Robert Shumley Brown across the portal, or you'll never see your physicist again.' Or should we use Fernando's name? What's his last name?" "That sounds a bit harsh, sweetie. Let's try to make it gentler." I pressed the stylus into the leaf to reveal the blue ink color beneath the top layer. When I was done, I read aloud. "We propose an exchange. When Robert Shumley Brown has returned to our universe, we will send Fernando back to Earth." It's not great, but there's probably no way to make a kidnapping seem friendly. Do you want to go with it? "It sounds good to me," she said, standing up. I followed her, gripping the leaf so hard, more blue showed through than was intended. I couldn't resist holding her hand. I loved her idealism, but I knew it wasn't possible to have the best of both universes, as she put it. I was the adult, and it was time to start acting like it. After all, I was the only one who could see how wrong it was to send a ransom note into another universe. I fretted over this being one of those situations in which the adult has to make the best decision, in spite of the mature-seeming child's wishes. She could find the portal whenever she wanted, but I'd waited 11 years for this moment. Would I ever be able to convince her to show me the way home again if we didn't step through now? "I wonder how long it'll take to hear back from them after we send the note," I said. I felt my face redden, but Roberta looked straight ahead, oblivious to my moral dilemma. When she stopped, I squinted for a second, until the glowing green portal became clear. Roberta looked at me and the leaf expectantly. I raised my hand deliberately toward the only way back to Providence. My heart in my throat, I dropped the leaf and stepped through the green squishiness, bringing her along by the hand as if she were an extension of my own body. 5. The trip between universes was as simple as I remembered. Half my body was still on the infinite white sky plane of Jiva when I could already see the dim basement with its wall of manuscripts, the work desk at the back, and a blurry line of people with tablets and sensors in front. Memories of what life had been like before I'd left Earth flooded back to me. Was that Robert near the staircase? The liquid image shifted, escaping from me before I could be sure what it was. I took a deliberate step forward into my original universe, into the place where both my daughter and I belonged. But at the same time, I felt a wrench, sharp and irresistible, and almost fell backward with Roberta's sudden strength. I grasped her tighter. The vision of the possible Robert beckoned me to a new life, with everyone I loved in the same place, but somehow Roberta's smooth little hand slipped away, a feather carried on the wind. And I stood alone, shoeless, wearing a jumpsuit made of orange and yellow checked leaves, which the green light turned a vague puce color, behind a clear plexiglass wall on the concrete floor of the basement on Atwells Ave. One of the people holding a tablet stepped toward the plexiglass, and I backed away. The clear screen had been the culprit of the blurriness during the crossing. The university had gotten more organized. I felt cut off, unmoored, a stranger, alien. "Stephanie!" the scientist with the tablet exclaimed, with unflappability I recognized. "Professor Asterion?" She looked the same, but more serious if possible. Then she smiled. "Stephanie, how wonderful to see you!" She poised a stylus over her tablet. "What kinds of pressure differences did you notice in the other universe? Have you noticed any effects or deficiencies from eating only 2 kinds of plants? What causes the shifts in the center of gravity in the other universe? It had been a long time since I'd been asked such dull questions, and I was sure I'd recorded the answers in the notebooks I'd left behind. I looked around the basement. To my right was a door in the plexiglass, with a keypad for punching codes near the handle. None of the other faces staring at me was familiar. I checked my oxygen levels, feeling suffocated. "Don't worry, we'll get you out of there and into quarantine as soon as the cleaners come to sanitize you," said Professor Asterion, as if her words would calm me. "How many years have passed for you? 5? Maybe 10? We're not clear on the way time passes in the other universe, from Professor Shumley Brown's rather literary description." There was no one in the space where I thought I'd seen Robert. "Where's Robert Shumley Brown?" My voice sounded thin and harsh. "Where is Professor Perez?" a woman in her 40s wearing huaraches barked. And there he was, emerging from the portal as if on cue, Fernando, whom I'd left on Jiva with barely a second thought. He threw off his oxygen tank, punched a sequence into the keypad, barged through the plexiglass door and shut it, and embraced the woman with huaraches, giving me a flush of envy. 5 or 6 scientists rushed to the couple, shoving sensors at them. "Now you'll both have to go into quarantine," said one. "Hey," I said through the plastic to Fernando. "You were going to be the reason they let us back through. How did you get here?" He released the woman, who must have been Bernice. I was glad to see she looked nothing like me. "Roberta gave me a severe talking to, fed me some of these root plants, then took me to the portal." "What did she tell you?" "She said not to bargain to send anyone back for her. She wants to live there with only Jivans because she can never trust you again." "Why did she say that?" His honest question wounded me. What Roberta said was true, of course. In spite of my misgivings about being a mother, all her life we'd had a scientific partnership, a level of equality and trust never seen on Earth. I had destroyed it by making the unilateral decision to live in our original universe. And there I was, feeling out of place at home, and yet again the 2 people I loved were in 2 different universes. "Bring me Robert Shumley Brown!" I roared. "We have to go back. Our daughter's still over there." Another woman in a lab coat with a sensor came to stand with Professor Asterion. "Professor Shumley Brown mentioned there could be a child involved. How old is she? Can she fend for herself?" "Well, where I left she was about 11, but while we futz about here, she's turning 12 and 13, and who knows what kind of emotional angst she's been going through with no humans around to explain her feelings to her." I doubted Roberta would listen to me, even about these matters no Jivan could talk about, but under so much strain it was all I could think of. Certainly, she could take care of herself, especially on Jiva, where no one would put up walls or ask stupid questions. The lady in the lab coat just stared at me, and I realized there was no reason she would ever think was good enough to let me go back to Jiva if I ever made it through the plexiglass door. "Come on, there's nothing threatening over there," I gestured at Fernando. "He doesn't even need to go into quarantine. There are no diseases on Jiva. Robert Shumley Brown doesn't need to prepare or bring anything. He just needs to come to this basement and step back over with me." I pressed my hands together and bowed slightly, acknowledging that they had the power and that I was asking them politely to use it for good. "Stephanie," whispered a masculine voice from above. I turned to see that most longed-for face on the stairs, close to where I thought I'd seen him before. His sparkling brown eyes opened wider, as if to better take in the sight of me. His wide smile, which seemed straighter than before, broke the delicate shell around my heart, and tears streamed from my eyes. I couldn't understand how I'd lived so long without seeing that face or holding that body to mine. I felt as if the merest breeze would make my skin disintegrate. I leaned on the plexiglass with knees that felt like jelly to reach Robert before I completely disappeared. Robert strode down the rest of the stairs and navigated the basement's maze of manuscripts and scientific equipment as if he were the designer. He put his palms against the plexiglass for me to meet. I had to look farther upward, and my hands were dwarfed against his. Though he appeared the same age as when I had last seen him, he was undeniably taller. His gray and brown hair twisted into crazy angles around his face, much curlier than before. But the way he looked at me, those big brown eyes, made it unnecessary to ask any questions. This was the man I'd been missing, dreaming of, and hoping for. My eyes smarted with the tears rolling down my cheeks. "You're alive," he breathed into the plastic. "So are you," I exclaimed. "I've had much longer to wonder." "I'm so sorry," he said, letting his gaze wander all over me. "You're so beautiful. We must be a lot closer to the same age. We won't turn so many heads here on Earth now." "We never turned heads on Jiva, and I don't think our daughter will ever come to Earth." He raised his eyebrows, and his face opened into unbridled joy. Our daughter is flourishing. I named her Roberta after you, and she's smarter than either of us. I grinned through my tears. Come through the portal with me now and meet her. I would have gone to you much sooner, but they won't let me. His voice resonated strangely along the plastic partition. I looked around the basement. Nothing seemed amiss. He appeared to have complete freedom of movement. What's stopping you? Professor Shumley Brown isn't authorized to touch the anomaly, said the scientist next to Professor Asterion. He doesn't have a code to enter the containment area. Robert shrugged in a helpless humanities professor way. I'm sure he took great care to develop over the years of his career. Why can't you let us be happy? It's so simple, and all humans ever do is make it difficult, I shouted. Come on, Robert, you love me, and that makes you strong. We can break through this plastic. Let's go get our daughter. By the time I'd wiped some of the tears out of my eyes, 4 people in the same type of hazmat suits Professor Asterion and I had used on our first day in the basement had materialized. One was leading Fernando and Bernice out of the basement in a civilized manner. A second one surprised Robert from behind and pinned his arms behind his back. A third made sure Robert didn't struggle while also watching the fourth one. This last one was patiently fat-fingering his way through an entry code into the plexiglass. He was coming for me. I pressed my hand to my heart, then to the plexiglass where Robert could see. Find me, darling, I called. I'll never stop waiting for you. When I turned toward the way home, it was already too late. The 2 hazmat men stood between me and the portal. I fainted between them, but they blocked me. I threw my arms out as if to envelop them in a group hug. My left hand reached the anomaly. When I felt a light nitrogen breeze from Jiva, I dug in, using my entire body to try and push us all through. They weren't having it, and their hands, enormous inside the gloves, gripped my shoulders. Tears still poured from my eyes, and I witnessed myself in that bizarre position, the love of my life trapped behind me as I fought for my daughter and what felt like my very life, because of a matter of centimeters. We might have stayed that way for eternity, but suddenly, a soft hand in Jiva took mine and pulled me with the 2 hazmat scientists as if it were the easiest thing in any universe. We were all in a heap. The sight of the white sky made me gasp with relief. It seemed more natural to have to inhale from my homemade nozzle than to breathe that basement air freely while everyone treated me like one more science experiment. My daughter stood over us, looking skeptical. Roberta, you pulled me back through. Our reunion would have to wait. The hazmat guys were gasping and not with relief. I sat on top of one. Roberta, I said, and she sat on the other. I looked into the man's panicked eyes. I hold no grudge against you. I'm going to send you back to Providence with your colleague. When? He squeaked. Right now. I just need you to promise you'll let Robert Shumley Brown come back to us. He nodded vigorously and looked at the other. I realized, peering through the helmet's screen, that she was a woman. Even if you have to help him sneak past the physics department? I grilled. She nodded, a bit less panicked than her companion. We'll do everything we can. It's just so easy, I said. I insist there is no reason Robert and I shouldn't be allowed to live here. How can you stand to live on Earth where no one knows how to be happy? My guy wasn't up to philosophical debates. His eyes were bugged out, and the parts of his cheeks I could see through the helmet were purple. I stood and dragged him up by the armpits. I turned him around and pointed. Right through there. He toppled through the portal, and the knapsack with my notes caught my eye. I tossed it in after him. Though Roberta pointed, the woman couldn't find the portal, so I said, Those were my notes from all the years I've lived here. I've sent them as a sign of good faith. With a grin, I pushed her toward the green orb. We were alone. Did you put the notebooks there? I asked Roberta. I was going to toss them through to you. Fernando mentioned you'd wanted to take them. That was when I saw your hand sticking out of the portal. And you pulled me through. I'm not sure why you were so powerful, but I might not have made it back without you. I opened my arms toward her, but she backed away. Your hand was moving strangely, so I thought you needed help and I gave it to you. I'm not a monster, but I'm not sure whether you're one. I felt another urge to weep, but I'd already dehydrated myself in Providence. Can we talk about this? All right, let's go home. She outpaced me enormously because I stumbled, and then I crouched to gather eyeberries. By the time I opened our house's grisly hatch, she was seated rigidly on the couch, exactly where Fernando had sat with similar tension what seemed like years before. She'd had time to rearrange some of the equipment, and it looked as if she had been taking her catnaps on the couch and not even bothering to go upstairs. You do understand why I did it, right? I said. Of course I do, she said too quickly. All right, tell me in your words. I sat next to her, and she slid away. You like Earth better than Jiva. You think Earthlings can only live on Earth. No, that's not true. I did feel a certain pull toward the place where I was born as soon as I saw the portal, and an even stronger pull to find your father. And then there was the issue of you not having other humans your age to socialize with. I stood and floated into my bedroom. No, of course I hadn't borrowed any books about Earth from the library. I'd been too focused on the physics of Jiva and its portals. I recognized that Roberta had never lived on Earth and had no sense that she might belong anywhere but Jiva. I needed to show her photos or descriptions of something wonderful about our home universe, so she might start to sympathize with me. I called down, What did you do with A Brief History of Time? I finished it ages ago. It's back in the library. It was pretty good for beginners. I liked the beginning where the woman describes Universe 11.011 so accurately. And then it's a running joke throughout the rest of the book, I said, floating down to her. Come with me to the library. I want to show you some of the wonderful things about Earth that you're missing out on. But from Earth, we don't have access to these other universes. The woman was theorizing, and Stephen Hawking didn't believe her at all. Here, we have evidence to prove her theory, or probably any theory anyone thinks up. We don't have to keep being ignorant and assuming we know everything. We can take 5 steps and find out something totally new. Roberta, yet again, revealed more sophistication than I would have guessed. She was like a fish, aware of the water she swam in. And Jiva did seem like a cornucopia in comparison with Earth's heap of dust. I inserted my nozzle into our oxygen reserve tank. But on Earth, we can breathe the air. She rolled her eyes at me. It's what I said. You like Earth better than Jiva. You were ready to give up everything we have here to go back to that dark, 4-dimensional place just because we can breathe the air. What do we have here? I wanted to see our strange life from her point of view. You mean aside from the scientific wonders? Aside from the freedom to pursue whatever interests us? Here's a good one. I've read a few books from Earth, and they all have people dying in them. I personally have never known a Jivan to look very old or die, not to mention that there are no diseases like the one Stephen Hawking had. Or infectious ones that we know of. How could I ever think a place with no disease wasn't the best choice for settling down? Jiva is wonderful, sweetie, but I couldn't help wanting to be with your father. She held up her finger as if it were a rising idea. Consider that my father is perfectly capable of living here with us. He may be on his way right now. Otherwise, what was all that about at the portal, nearly suffocating those people? How do you know he wants to live here? Did you see him? I did. He does. He loves you as much as he loves me. I saw it in his eyes. Even as I spoke with conviction, the confusing images and bizarre events in the basement flashed back. Aside from Robert's loving gaze, the sensation I took away from the basement was overwhelming alienation. The thought of going back there made me feel faint. I rode out a center of gravity shift, then unplugged my nozzle and knelt on the floor in front of the couch. I took her hands in mine, and she didn't flinch. I'm glad I've seen the other side of the portal, because it gave me a glimpse of Robert. Now I'm surer than ever that he must return to us, but I've also seen that the new life we've created here together is far more important than anything I've left on Earth. It was a betrayal to try to take you to that place, and I'm so sorry. Can you ever forgive me? Her extraordinary intellect wasn't equipped to cope with these issues. I saw confusion roiling in her eyes. Finally, she pulled her hands away and folded her arms. If I knew you would never do anything like that again... The house tilted more quickly than usual, and I crashed onto my side. I took the opportunity to stand and plug the nozzle back in. My tank wasn't full yet. Would there ever be a situation like that again, in which I would want to force Roberta to do something? It seemed unlikely, but I was too honest to make a promise on the basis of unknowns. I don't plan to betray Jiva and you ever again. The problem is that I can't swear to what I'll do in the future after a day like today. Situations might exist in which my role as your mother is more important than my role as your scientific partner. I never thought of that before. It had never occurred to me either, but there I was, thinking I was doing what was best. We hashed it out for hours, and as the words tumbled out of us more and more haltingly, it became obvious that our relationship was fundamentally different. It was partly natural that our lives would change as she headed into prepubescence, but mostly it was her refusal to forgive my motherly treachery. In the end, she walked out. I let her go, knowing she'd be back for oxygen. We constructed a whole new status quo. We created oxygen reserves in several of her friends' houses so she could stay out longer and develop independent lines of research. While Roberta was off discovering new universes or figuring out why the rock waterfall responded to poetry, I renewed my commitment to this universe and began my study of the Jivan language in earnest. Starting out in the corner of the library where all languages were one, I eventually took my conversation partners for strolls on the plain, where I stared obsessively at the area where I thought the portal was, even as I made repeated attempts to sound something like them. Roberta and I came together every day for lunch on the plain. Otherwise, I might have gone days and days without seeing her at all. With my fledgling linguistic skills, I could almost follow what she and her friends talked about, and the adults were patient with me, trying to explain what I'd missed. It was better than living in a strife-ridden universe without her. We eventually reached a certain level of cordiality when she was obliged to collect oxygen reserves at our house. After that point, she provided me with tips and tricks for finding the portal back to Providence. One grand day, I found it all by myself while strolling with the librarian. "Look, look! There it is! I found it!" After I said it, I realized it had come out in Jivan. The librarian said something like, "Awesome! I knew you could do it!" and emitted happy pastel colors at me. I knew the day was coming when the hazmat scientists would keep their promise. Even if they had made it under duress, I couldn't conceive that they had been anything but sincere. A promise made on Jiva, where kidnapping and deviousness were unknowns, seemed many times more sacred than an earthly one. From that day on, I hardly took my gaze off the portal. I mulled over the unexpected physical differences in Robert. Was my recollection just that faulty? I cloudily recalled having read fascinating case studies about the fundamental unreliability of human memory that showed that vital confidence in the accuracy of a memory never falters, even when presented with contradictory evidence. I could have sworn on Copernicus's heliocentric theory that the Robert I met in Providence and spent about a year on Jiva with was not as tall, as straight-mouthed, or as curly-haired as the Robert I saw through the plastic. I decided these perceived differences didn't matter when I remembered his eyes. They were unquestionably Robert's. The way he looked at me, as if I embodied all the poetry he'd ever read, led me know that it was a scientific certainty that we would be together again. It happened on a day in which all the little things went wrong. I'd somehow misunderstood when to meet one of my conversation partners at the library, and I'd spent the day wandering the plain by myself, feeling lonely, even though I always had the portal home in my sights. Aggressive plants managed to bite my big toe. Because it was so close to lunchtime, I decided not to go home to wrap it in leaves, and the blood seemed to make them even more belligerent. Then, when everyone appeared for lunch, Roberta was in a mood, and sat in a separate circle with her back to me. It was enough to make me consider walking back through the portal. Kirk Vigence's cloud-blue crest obscured my view, while I showed him the evidence of my lousy day. So I missed the exact instant everything changed. But when my Jivan friend bowed his head to savor a spongy root between the parts of his crest, I glimpsed once again the shape of a human male. I shot up, and the vision was even clearer. He had an oxygen tank and scuba-inspired mouthpiece like the one Fernando had carried, a blue and green plaid shirt, and camel-colored corduroy pants that seemed more real to me than anything from the past decade of my life. "Stephanie!" I heard him call. He ran toward me with his own particular grace. I reached down and pulled Roberta up by the hand. "What?" she said. "Be nice, sweetie. Come and say hi to your dad." The author. Jessica Knauss has always been interested in writing fiction that challenges reality. The idea of a mysterious house on Atwells Avenue in Providence, with a glowing green basement, came to her as an explanation for the 3 strange texts that make up her first novel, Awash in Talent. But those stories stood on their own, and Atwells Ave was set aside for a few years. In 2016, Jessica's forever love, Stanley Arthur Coombs, passed away suddenly. She felt she'd been sucked into the wrong universe. The Atwells Avenue Anomaly has been a key element of her grief journey, and hopefully the first in a large family of new imaginative books. Jessica now lives where she's always dreamed of living, Spain, and works as a freelance editor until the right moment to move into her castle with a rhino grazing range. She also publishes medieval historical fiction as J.K. Knauss. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this book, please give this video a like and definitely subscribe for more mind-blowingly wonderful stories. Thank you.